Alright guys, Bill, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video I'm back with another review, this time for the latest season of the Traitors US Season 2. A season that, obviously there was a lot of hype coming into the season, and I personally was very excited. I mean, there were a lot of big names from some of my favorite shows on this show, to where that alone made me extremely hyped for the show. Though despite that, I did come into this season with some reservations. I do feel like before this season, I was feeling a little bit burnt out on the Traitors. I do feel like the Traitors is a show that we've just been getting a lot of over the last really less than a year and a half. We're really just in the last few months. I mean, we've had the Traitors NZ, Traitors AU, Traitors Canada, Traitors UK was literally airing at the time that this season started airing. And again, it was just a lot of Traitors. And I do feel like with some of the later seasons there, I did feel burnt out when watching those seasons, where I was worried that coming into this season that I wouldn't feel that enjoyment that I would typically get from the show. However, the first half of the season ended up being extremely strong, where it kind of rejuvenated my love of the Traitors to a point where I was thinking that this could possibly be one of the best seasons of the show across all of its versions, only for us to get to the back half of the season, which probably brings us one of the biggest discrepancies in the level of quality of a Traitor season up to this point, and the fact that the first half is really strong while the second half is just such a massive slog, where it felt like a lot of the bigger players of the season were kind of just being led to the slaughter, and some of the less game savvy people end up running the show, which again just did not end up being as interesting to me. So overall, I do come out of this season being very conflicted on it. I mean, while there is some great stuff in the first half of the season, as we'll talk about, I do feel like the sluggish pace of the back portion of the season definitely did harm it in the grand scheme of things. But I'll still be talking about the season from beginning to end, talking about my thoughts along the way. So let's start off with the premiere, where obviously we start off with Alan talking about how he's assembled a group of cunning celebrities and reality TV legends. Where obviously this season took the casting formula used for season 1 of the Traitors to a further extreme, where in season 1 it was a half and half season, half newbies, half reality TV stars. This season goes all in on reality TV stars / celebrities. And again, I do think that is a change that I am personally fine with. I can understand why people would be upset at that, as that essentially means we'll never get like truly normal people on this show. But really, I feel like we have other versions for that. I mean, the Traitors of the show, again, there's so many different iterations out there. Other versions of the show do have normal people still on there. I mean, the Traitors UK is entirely newbie cast. And considering how many other reality shows there are outside of the Traitors in the United States, I don't feel like we need for there to be another show fully comprising of newbies. Now, again, for me, it's either go all newbies or go all celebrities. I think the mixing that was done in season 1 did not turn out the greatest. But again, I'm perfectly fine with us just going all celebrities here. And again, I thought it brought us a really fun cast here. I do think it's an interesting prospect for down the road of just, again, who could possibly show up on this show, considering some of the big names they were to get for this season, and considering how small of a commitment the show is in the grand scheme of things. But anyway, we have the players being driven in and eventually enter the mansion, where they're given time to get to know each other before the game formally starts, which obviously allows for player introductions and set up of previous relationships. The first person we end up hearing talking here is Marcus Jordan, the son of Michael Jordan, which is, again, it's like random that he's on their show, but again, he gets hyped up as this cutthroat player and someone that actually played the game a lot more intellectually than I was expecting, to where despite his short run on the season, he was definitely a surprise to me, though he is coming in this season with his girlfriend, Larsa Pippen. Obviously being this somewhat interesting dynamic here. I mean, we've seen boyfriend and girlfriend in the past on the Traitors, though they were trying to keep their relationship a secret. This time, obviously, it was out in the open. Really, I don't feel like that aspect of it really got utilized to its fullest degree, as obviously it just makes them a massive target, and one of them is going to go home relatively early, but still an interesting dynamic to add to the show here. Beyond that, we then get introduced to Parvati, who gets asked who she doesn't want to see, to which she says Sandra. And what do you know? Sandra's also there. Both of which getting a good amount of content here, with their relationship being a major focus in the first half of this episode, making it pretty clear that they were going to be important to this season. And again, was a fun dynamic coming into the season, where obviously, wherever you don't know, Parvati and Sandra just recently got into a Twitter feud over who exactly is the queen of Survivor, and for them to not have seen each other until they meet up on the Traitors was, again, a funny dynamic here. So they do end up agreeing to work together here, which obviously is to their benefit. Though Sandra does say that the first sign of deception, that she'll take care of her once and for all, feeling like set up to the dissolution of their relationship down the road. But beyond that, we also get a lot of focus on CT. Where do you see CT seeing Bananas, to where CT says, of course, Banana Head is here. But again, setting up that relationship there, along with the fact that we also get set up on CT's relationship with Trishelle, with them talking about having not always got along and not trusting each other at this point, which obviously set them up as this long-term dynamic as well. Despite the fact that Bananas is in the room while these confessionals are happening, Bananas' relationship with Trishelle is never mentioned, which kind of screamed out as Bananas not being as important to the season storyline. But then we get introduced to Dan and Janelle, with Dan saying that they haven't seen each other in over a decade, with Dan saying that the last time he saw her was when he was writing her name down and voting her out of the Big Brother house, which he says this multiple times on this season, which makes me wonder, like, does Dan forget how Big Brother works? But Dan ends up being this main narrator for the early portions of this season, really propping up the cast in this instance, and really just making it clear that he's going to be a major character for down the road. But then we get introduced to Phaedra, who talks about being a bit in over her head and that the Lord is going to need to help her through this game, saying that the survivors hike naked and eat rattlesnakes, which I don't think has ever been on the show. But anyway, we do see her conversation with CT once again, with their relationship being constantly reiterated across the season, despite her supposedly also being extremely close to like Bergie, which only gets shown when necessary. Even her relationship with the likes of Sheree, who she's supposedly super close to outside of the show, doesn't get mentioned throughout most of the season, where again Phaedra's most propped up relation on the season is with CT, someone who she hadn't met before, despite there being people that she had relationships with. But anyway, we also get introduced to John, who is a former Speaker of the House for the UK, which is weird that he's on the show. And it's funny too, because it does seem to put a big target on his back early on, and the fact that people just found him sketchy because he is a politician, though that very quickly disappears, to where just no one really took him seriously after that. But also we do have Bananas being introduced here, with him leading the toast, to where Janelle tells Kevin that Bananas has won the challenge 7 times, only for him to be confused over what the challenge is. But anyway, that leads up to the traitor selection, to where here we do actually get to see Alan talking to the players one-on-one, something that the UK actually did, but for some reason they didn't do it in US Season 1. So they did it here, which is a good way to give this insight into the players and what they're thinking, what they want to do in the game. Now, realistically, it doesn't really matter, as obviously the producers just picking who the traitors are. But again, I do think this is a nice visualization for the TV show at least. But this also leads to this funny moment of Bananas saying to Alan, how's it feel to be the second best dressed guy in the house, only for Alan to say back off, bitch. But really, we do end up seeing all of the Big Brother and Survivor players really wanting to be traitors here, with Dan saying that he only came on the show to be a traitor. And what do you know? Dan is the first traitor, saying it's hunting season, they won't see him coming, except the fact that they do. All while we then see Phaedra being picked as well, saying that she's going to be queen of the castle. And Phaedra ends up detailing a pretty optimal strat here, saying that she's just going to listen and take notes, but not actually participate, do just enough, but not too much, and that's the key to this game. Obviously something that Dan ends up severely lacking, as we later see. But this is also where we get the reveal that the traitors are not yet complete, where they get the power to enlist one other player, a twist that we had literally just seen done on the Traitors UK Season 2, which straight up again, Traitors UK Season 2 was finished airing before the end of this season, and many of that season's new twists in its format were directly copied into US 2, with them obviously being made by the same production team and filmed in the same location and filmed back to back. And again, it makes a lot of sense of why that's the case, though I do think that kind of took away a lot of the luster of some of these twists, in the fact that again, I just seen these on another show before. But anyway, this is a cool power here. I do like this fact that the traitors themselves get some agency in dictating who is working alongside them. Though I will say something that I do find a little bit underwhelming, the fact that we didn't get more traitors, as again, UK Season 2 did start off with 4 traitors, to where I wonder if they thought that was too many for that season. But again, like, this is a season ripe with really great traitor candidates here, so the fact that we only got 3 initially is kind of underwhelming. But obviously they don't make this decision on who to recruit until the end of the episode. But first we do get some focus on people's initial suspicions, where we see Janelle talking about John was breathing really hard, to which he later claims that he has asthma. Kind of a throwaway moment, though something that actually does become somewhat focused on later down the road. You also get Larsa saying her hearing is really good and she heard Alan lift his jacket to the left, calling out the person to her left, that person being Parvati. And we get this line that was in all the trailers of Banana pointing to her and saying, "Are you saying she's the traitor?" And I did love Parvati's reaction to this, so the fact that she seemed like genuinely insulted to be called out here, and instead tries to paint Larsa as the traitor instead. Though in a way, I do think this actually kind of worked out for Parvati in the fact that through her having this initial sus on her, it did actually make her a much more juicy target to be recruited into the game, which puts her into a much better position in the game. But here we also get some other introductions, getting introduced to Ekin Su, who talks about being underestimated, to then talk about how she believes in conspiracy theories and loves cartoons that can twist her arm all the way back, which is like just a weird confessional, especially considering how like not underestimated she comes off throughout this season. But here we do end up seeing an awkward convo between her and Bergie, where the rest of the cast ends up mocking how red Bergie's face is, and Banana saying he's not cut out for this life, to where Bergie then talks about how he just wants to prove that he's not easily manipulated, which does lead to this pretty decent arc across this season, him being one of the better detectives on the board. But anyway, that takes us to our first mission, where everyone arrives at the lake. Well, everybody but Tamra, as Tamra is not feeling well, so she doesn't participate in the challenge. Which, I mean, the fact that they just let her stay behind kind of shows you how irrelevant these challenges are. But the challenge itself ends up having the players having to gather these floating puzzle pieces and arrange them into a pattern that they had to find on the shore. Again, literally the same opening challenge from the Traitors UK that just aired. Though following in suit with that season, they do have a minor improvement to the challenges here. The fact that shields can be won within them, where previously there were chances to win the shield where you go to the armory after the fact and it would be a random chance there. Here, there's a lot more proactiveness in how you get the shield. Again, you can either work with a team or you can go out on your own to try to grab the shield. And again, it adds just an interesting dynamic to the challenges. Now, straight up, again, I still don't love the challenges on the show. I still just don't love the aspect of everyone working together to increase the prize pool, as again, I don't care how much money they make. And the fact that they actually have to build up this money to begin with just screams out as being cheap from a production point of view, them not being willing to just fully set a full prize amount. And I mean, straight up, I mean, like, obviously they do still sometimes provide some pretty fun character moments, though, again, not enough to really prop up the season that much. But here we do learn that there are going to be 2 shields in the water and 1 on land, which, you know, saying that obviously she's going to go for the shield, to where we do see them start the challenge tied up. Janelle is the first one to break free and ends up saying she doesn't care about the other people and just goes for the shield, putting a target on her back. People talking about how selfish she is, though at the same time, it should make it pretty clear that she's a faithful. The fact that she's going so far out of her way to get a shield here, so in a way, it kind of should have worked to her benefit. But anyway, Bergie is the last to get untied here, to where we get this funny moment of Sandra and Phaedra having to help him get loose, not helping his initial storyline there. Though really we see CT and Bananas really leading the challenge here. Obviously with their experience from the challenge coming to roost here, though we do see CT leaving his boat to get a shield alongside Deontay, to which neither of them get much blowback for that, but they do end up finishing the challenge anyway with 1 second left, I guess, because I guess that's how close every challenge ends up being. Like, straight, just felt like that was added here for suspense. But this does lead to CT saying that the others are lucky that him and Bananas are working together to get the money, which felt like clear setup to that not being the case for much longer. But here we do get some final interactions before the players go to sleep for the night, to where we do see this big group conversation where Peppermint does say that she wants to survive long enough to show off all of her outfits, with Rochelle saying me too, and then making a joke saying that if I'm murdered then she's the traitor, to which Peppermint gives this like really insulted reaction to, which I assumed was a joke at first, though it seemed like everyone took this like pretty seriously, to where it actually ends up painting this big target on her, as we'll talk about. But really the rest of the episode is largely focused on this dilemma of who are they going to recruit, where Phaedra talks about wanting to recruit someone not like her, thinking about recruiting CT, saying that he's the ultimate gamer and that she also has a crush on him. All this content not really leading to much here, as Phaedra essentially lets Dan do whatever he wants to do, where we do get a lot from Dan and him having these different one-on-one conversations, really trying to gauge who he should pick there, where we see him talking to Janelle, where he talks about having to work together and that he can trust her. He also talks about considering Parvati and that she makes a living getting people to trust him, that she's the female version of him. Well, also we get this funny conversation between him and Sandra, where it's essentially just him fangirling over her, only for Max to walk in on this conversation, and Dan says come in, only for Max to say no. and just walks away, to where they're obviously annoyed at the fact that he didn't talk to them. But again, just a funny interaction there, really just showing off how awkward Max ends up being on the season. But either way, the episode ends with Dan and Phaedra doing the Traitors Oath and meeting for the first time, to where they then have to make this decision on who to recruit, to which we don't get to see who they end up picking, and all we see is Alan going to deliver this letter, having this over-the-top editing as he says, "Welcome to the dark side," and slides this note under the door, even though in the next episode, the note is on a chair. And straight, I would have hated this cliffhanger if it were not for the fact that the first 3 episodes were released all at once, where that made it a lot more palatable as we just go straight into episode 2, where again, we find out it's Parvati. And who would have guessed? She accepts the offer, obviously. But obviously, this is a perfect choice here. I mean, exactly what I would have wanted. Again, seeing Dan and Parvati, 2 of the biggest names from their respective shows, working together is just such a fever dream there. And just strategically, I think it's the right call for the most part. I think the worry for Dan in particular is obviously the fact that there's no other guy in the Traitors, and through that, essentially, through people metagaming it, obviously, it's going to be assumed that there's going to be at least one guy traitor, and until they find one, Dan will just have a bigger target on his back. So that's definitely a qualm with picking Parvati. But I mean, considering how much he trusted Parvati in the game and could work alongside her, and also the fact that there was obviously this potential for throwing her under the bus with all this other stuff around her, again, it felt like a good initial choice here. Something that doesn't really pay off in the long term, with him seeming to be a bit too loyal to Parvati by the end. But either way, we do have Dan and Phaedra having to decide who to murder here, where Dan ends up mentioning bananas, to which Phaedra counters this, saying that they need him for missions, but says that Dan understands the game and that he won Big Brother twice, which he definitely did. Again, funny how much Big Brother misinformation is being spread on this season. And straight up, I do think the target of bananas here is a bit of a misguided play for Dan, obviously starting this string of very questionable decisions from Dan, which again, we'll talk about more of them down the road. But again, the targeting of bananas, I do feel like is one that just seems like this massive misread on bananas, where Dan talks about how bananas is one of the few people that can figure them out, when it's like, I don't feel like that's ever been bananas' strong suit, is his ability to read people. I feel like bananas always struggles in these situations where people stab him in the back, where again, he's always focused on stabbing people from the front. But I feel like the Traitors is not really a game that suited to bananas, and mixing that with the fact that bananas is also a massive loudmouth and will get himself in trouble, make himself a much bigger target than Dan. Again, I do feel like just all around, this is a very misguided move. Either way, with that, we do lose bananas, so I guess we'll just talk about him here. And bananas, again, like, didn't get to do much on this season. He's the first out, and I think that's always been an underwhelming aspect of the Traitors format, is that someone's always going to get murdered right away, and through that not really have much to do on this season, not even attend a first formal roundtable. And yeah, I do think that's a lame aspect of the format, that bananas just get sniped out here, though also it's really funny that bananas get sniped out here, where again, I've never been the biggest bananas fan. I do feel like seeing him being taken out first here just felt kind of glorious to me, especially considering how easy of a ride he has on most challenge seasons he ends up appearing on at this point, to where seeing him just have no real shot to play the Traitors was kind of funny. Though straight up, I think he's still good TV, to where if he were to show up on season 3 or something, I would not be opposed to that. I do think he is someone that could make good TV on the Traitors, just again, I guess it wasn't meant to be on this season. But with that, we do continue on the episode with the breakfast the following morning, where this is where we do get introduced to Peter, who says that people don't know how strategic he can be, with Pete somehow coming off as one of the better players of this season, which was completely mind-blowing coming into the season. The fact that he was outplaying the likes of Dan and Parvati, 2 of the best social strategy players we've ever seen. But also here we do get the start of Trishelle talking about what happened with her and Peppermint, to where this seems to instantly point this target on Peppermint's back, to where it largely felt unfounded. I know Trishelle got a lot of hate following this episode, calling her transphobic, and obviously I don't really feel like that's the case, but I mean, it's certainly not a good look to be going so hard for Peppermint here in a situation where it just felt very trivial, the reasons that you're going for. But anyway, we get the reveal that Bananas was murdered, where obviously everyone is shocked, and this does lead to Peppermint kind of putting her foot in her mouth a bit, where just talk about how Bananas is someone who can't be controlled, which Janelle points out that sounds like a true traitor, which I mean obviously is just a throwaway comment, but again, you shouldn't really be talking like that on the Traitors. Like, they're really just going to use anything you say to that nature against you. But we do get some humor following this of Peppermint saying that this is some bullshit in confessional, and gets up and says to Trishelle that if you get murdered, it'll be by my look, not because I'm a traitor, which again, fun content that Peppermint provides here. But at the end of the day, it became very clear Peppermint was going to be the first vote out here. But before that, we obviously get to our next mission, where they're split into groups of 3 and have to answer questions from a questionnaire, while having to carry boxes with the answers to a scarecrow field, where they then have to randomly search the scarecrows for gold, which was kind of lame that it just comes down to luck. There's also 3 shields hidden inside some specifically colored scarecrows, which does add this interesting dynamic again of, do you go for the gold or do you go for the shield? But the questions here actually surprisingly play a pretty big factor into future events, where we do get the question, whose opinion do you value? And the answer here is Marcus, where Phaedra talks about using this information against him, which ends up making Marcus this big target on the board. Beyond that, we do get the question of who's the most popular player, where surprisingly Peppermint gets picked here, despite the fact that, again, Peppermint is being targeted by most of the house. This does lead to some funny moments from every team getting this wrong, and Peppermint being really insulted that they don't pick her, only for her to be the right answer anyway. But then we could probably get the most important question here in who needs to speak up more, to which the answer ends up being Dan. To which Dan says that his heart sank when he saw this, and that he doesn't want to change up how he's playing, despite the fact that this ends up being probably the biggest fault of his entire game here, and the fact that he is playing so under the radar, and he's trying to get away with not saying anything and not upsetting anybody, again, kind of being in line with the way that he played Big Brother. I mean, like, straight up, I don't feel like there's that much of a difference between how he plays the Traitors here and how he tries to play the early days of Big Brother. The problem is that the Traitors is, again, not a social strategy game. You're not voting off people based on who you like the most or who you hate the most. You're voting out people based on who you think is a traitor, and by him not talking to people and not giving his opinion, it really just adds more suspicion on him, which is obviously a really bad look for him in the game. I think this first true instance of us seeing that Dan's game isn't really one that is able to translate to the Traitors. But this does lead to Dan talking about how he now needs to get the shield to keep his cover, and what do you know, Dan's the only one to get a shield. And they do end up winning most of the money on the board here, but beyond this, we do end up, again, having some setup for the round table, where Tamara says that she thinks that's John. So during the challenge, she had asked him if he has an inhaler, and he said that he doesn't have one, leading to Tamara thinking that he must be the traitor because he claimed he had asthma, which was all just kind of ridiculous. But here we do also see a lot of conversations between Dan and Parvati, where we do see them constantly being alone together, to where, again, it should have been very clear to people just how close they were in the game, which, considering the sus that Parvati had on her and the fact that Dan had growing sus as well, was probably not a good look in the grand scheme of things. Though it is funny here that he ends up lying to her about being a traitor, despite the fact that he knows that she's a traitor. But obviously, I assume they're not allowed to tell each other. But again, that was a funny little moment that Dan does talk about here, wanting to work with her. But here we do see Peppermint going on the campaign trail, where she makes a bit of a slip up here in saying that if Trishelle is so concerned about banishing a traitor, and then corrects herself saying a faithful, to where that's when a lot of people call her out. Larsa saying that you threw yourself under the bus again, to where now there's a lot of talk about how she called herself a traitor, which, I mean, I guess, but I feel like the phrasing of this was like kind of confusing just in its own right, to where I don't really fault her for mixing the words up. And the fact that like everyone talks about this after the fact as if she literally just said I'm a traitor is kind of ridiculous again. But again, we do get to the round table, where obviously a lot of the focus is around the Trishelle Peppermint situation, and again, it has a lot of fun bickering between the two. This all leads up to the likes of Sheree and Max and MJ backing Peppermint up here, though it really doesn't go anywhere, to where it felt pretty clear she was going to get voted out. Though we do get Janelle and Tamara mentioning John's breathing again, leading to a lot of weird bickering over what the exact wording that John used was, which Tamara calls him out for sounding like a politician. But again, we get to the votes, where most people end up voting for Peppermint, with Trishelle ending up being the deciding vote there, sending her out, leading to obviously the reveal that she's a faithful, with Trishelle now looking like a massive idiot, and Deontay getting content talking about the struggle of voting out Peppermint as he really related to her, and that he's now a part of this, really showing the start of his downward trajectory in the game. But MJ does mention at this point that the people that we have to target are the quiet people, with Marcus and proceeding to talk to Dan, and says how he doesn't say a word, and is calling him out, saying that people that don't speak up are people that are happy with how it's going, which, I mean, straight up, why is Marcus saying this? I mean, if he does think that Dan is a traitor, which, again, it does seem like he does, why are you telling the traitor that I'm on to you? But still, obviously, just very clear that Dan is being set up as a target from this point forward, with people seeming to catch on just how quiet he was being. But we do end the episode with the Traitors meeting, where we obviously get a cliffhanger, where the episode cuts away as Parvati everybody ends up seeing who the other traitors are, which just gets resolved in the following episode 3, which aired in the same day, where we get to episode 3, where obviously there we get talk about who to murder, where there's talk about murdering Deontay as he could get a shield, where, I mean, pretty quickly the target ends up landing on Marcus, where Dan talks about how he could catch up to them, and Phaedra talks about how he was voted as a person that most people would listen to, and also the fact that he has Larsa in the game. Again, it felt very obvious that Marcus was getting eliminated here, especially from the fact that they literally spoiled this in the trailer. And the trailer does explicitly have a line where Ekin-Su does say that, "Why would I murder your boyfriend?" Which, who else could that be? But with that, I think now's the time that we'll talk about the 2 eliminated players. Starting off with Peppermint, who I thought was really fun in the show. Again, obviously great representation. Having a drag queen on the show, also being transgender representation, where I really liked having someone like Peppermint on the show. I was really disappointed to see her go home so early, considering the fact that she was such a big character and something that could have been really great TV moving forward, though it feels like there really was this like mob mentality against her, which was, again, kind of disappointing to see, especially when like the initial sus on her was something that was so flimsy. And like, to be fair, again, I don't think she reacts to it particularly well. I think her comment about bananas is a bit sketchy. The slip up of her saying traitor instead of faithful is, again, not good, but still something, again, I was a bit underwhelmed to see go home this early. Then we get to Marcus, who I was also underwhelmed to see go home this early. Again, Marcus seemed like a really strong player, one that, again, seemed very intellectual, and someone that I think if he was a traitor, he would have been a really deadly player. But obviously it wasn't meant to be, and instead he becomes obviously this big target for them to take out. But again, I think there definitely is a lot of game ability there of Marcus, much more than I was expecting, to where, again, I would love it if he were to end up on something like Survivor. I think he could do extremely well if he was on a show like that. But in reality, we'll probably never truly see his social strategy ability really come to roost. But anyway, with that, let's continue on with the episode, where we do obviously have the breakfast, where Larsa initially ends up talking about saving a seat for when Marcus comes in, which I wonder what's going to happen there. Here we do get some focus on Trishelle, with her talking about how after her mistake the previous day that she needs to hold back today, which, and felt like pretty good content from her. The fact that we're getting this insight into her strategy in the game, which made her feel like faithful that was in it for the long haul. But on that, we also see Dan and Peter enter, to where Dan says that Peter is smart, but not smart enough to know that he's sitting next to a traitor, really showing Dan's arrogance in this situation, showing him really just underestimate Peter, which ends up leading to his downfall. But obviously we get to the reveal that Marcus was killed, to which we do get some overacting from Dan, which I did find it really funny to see Dan's reactions at points across this season. But here we do see Phaedra consoling Larsa, which gets ridiculously turned against her later in the season. No, Larsa ends up also giving this big speech about Marcus, somehow gets used to get her down the road. But obviously sets up this kind of like revenge storyline from her for getting a lot of content about how she's now really focused on taking out the traitors. But anyway, we get to the mission, which takes place at nighttime, where the players are driven out to a graveyard, where we do see gravestones of previous players, which was humorous. But they do have to end up finding gold in these graves, needing to get tools to open them up, where also inside some of them are shields, though a major aspect of the challenge itself ends up being the reveal that there's a spotlight going around the area, and if you're caught in the light, you're automatically eliminated, which is actually a pretty fun challenge here. I actually did like this one. I thought it was pretty innovative. Also really fun the fact that this episode structure literally aired the same night in the UK, so I literally watched these two challenges back to back. But again, I felt like it worked out for pretty good TV here. You get this funny moment from John being the first eliminated and him just yelling out disaster in his confessional, again literally being caught in just a few seconds. We also get CT saying that this is a challenge made for him, to where he's the first person to find a tool, only to then get caught immediately after that. This ends up being a big moment for Bergie, where Bergie talks about having figured out the light pattern, to where while no one initially listens to him, eventually they do. Which ends up being this nice moment of him coming into his own here, which felt like this progression of his storyline. So here we do see Tamara and Peter get shields, to where there's only one shield left. So we do end up seeing Janelle and Ekin-Su wrestle for it, with Janelle ending up getting it. Again, funny that this is essentially a redo of the Janelle James fight from Big Brother All-Stars, but also ends up being extremely ironic here, as Ekin really needed it in this instance. But obviously this entire situation ends up creating a lot of drama moving forward, where we do see them complaining a lot about each other on the way back to the mansion, and Ekin ends up saying that she stole it from her hands, which is not exactly how it played out. But again, to lead up to the round table, we do see Bergie and Trishelle talk about the person that took out Marcus was probably someone that was talking to Marcus and figured out how strategic he was, which does seem to put some of the sus on Dan, where Trishelle does talk about how Dan is a likely target here, all while we do also see Larsa talking about how the only person that would target bananas and CT would be a man, which I don't get how. Doesn't really make sense. So this does lead to this awkwardness between Dan and Larsa in a conversation between the two, where Dan clearly figures out that Larsa is coming for him here. Oh, we see MJ also targeting Dan, putting a lot of heat onto him coming into the round table. But this is where we see Max finally coming back to the story, where people ask him what does he think, where he doesn't say anything and instead just eats his sandwich and moves on to the other room, being really sketchy once again. So this is where we get Deontay talking about Max is looking sus and nervous and that he's no actor. Says that he's gonna follow his heart and that if you do, you won't regret it, which he does. Also, we do get a little bit of intrigue coming into the round table as well from a smaller conversation between Peter and Kevin, to where we do see Peter talking about getting creative and creating this fake tension between him and Kevin, with them creating this plot to vote against each other so that the traitors will keep them in, thinking that they're sus on them, which again is a pretty innovative strategy there. Again, I do like what Peter is doing here. He is playing the game very strategically. Now, I do think some of his plans are probably not as great as the show props them up to be. I mean, while this is, again, pretty good, in the sense that, again, like having more sus on you does make it less likely that you're going to be murdered, it also creates this feud between you and Kevin to where now the traitors can just murder one of you and then pin it on the other person. So again, that's not great. But again, it does end up working out for him. But either way, we get to the round table to where we do get a lot of focus around Dan, with him having to stick up for himself. And to be fair, I think he does so pretty well here, talking about how he knows he's quiet and it takes a while for him to open up, says that he wants people to know that when he says a name, he means it and he doesn't miss, obviously setting it up for him throwing a traitor under the bus for down the road. There's at least this funny moment from MJ saying that if everyone played the game like you, there would not be a game, which is kind of ironic coming from MJ, who was not super present in the episodes up to this point. But obviously a major focus here ends up being put onto Max, where we have Deontay saying that people changed on him and this man is charming, intelligent, has a poker face that can fool a con, to where he calls out Max, saying the way he moves is of a traitor. So we then see Sandra kind of backing him up in a situation where Sandra very clearly was very important to this vote, where we hear people talk about how Sandra was the one to get them on board, yet despite that, she was simply just not that focused on this episode, which again led to very conflicting messages to me edit-wise. But either way, we do have Max then proceeding to throw out Janelle and Ekin, with Ekin saying it was black and white and that Janelle barged into her, linked to this bickering between the two, with Janelle saying that she's lying. But this ends up putting more heat onto Max, with people calling out how he's just trying to throw the sus off of him, to where we also have Max then proceeding to call out CT, saying that only CT would come for bananas, I guess, which obviously coming for CT here is not a good look either. Again, just making even more enemies. But this is when Larsa ends up saying that we're not on the right path and that she does think it's Dan, saying that Max is not a gamer while Dan could be a killer, which, I mean, again, she's not wrong, but again, it's all for naught, as we do get to the vote reveal, to where we do get Parvati interestingly saying that it's not time to turn on Dan yet, so where she does end up writing a D and then scratching it off, which I assume is her trying to play into the fact that she thinks Dan's a traitor, but it's also just kind of a bad move here, as it's kind of so over the top, as why wouldn't you just completely scratch it out? It makes it very clear this is a move to try to impact your perception, and instead ends up voting for Kevin here because he's an actor, which again doesn't really do much either. Well, Phaedra here ends up voting for Ekin, which surprisingly ends up causing some drama later on, but most of the votes here end up going on to Max, and ends up saying no long speeches, I'm a faithful. But Deontay ends up being extremely devastated in this moment, obviously having led this vote, and through that says that he can't take this anymore and it takes a toll on him, which obviously proceeds to him quitting the game later on the following episode, this being the last of the content he really gets on this season, as by the time of his eventual quit, he's pretty much an afterthought. So at this point, I mean, let's just break down and talk about both of those people here. Starting off with Max, who again, like, Max was just kind of sketchy in this season. Like, I mean, really, it should have been obvious that he wasn't a traitor. He was just kind of a socially awkward guy. But and the fact that he would just like walk in on conversations, not add anything, and just walk away, despite people wanting him to talk to them, was again just so sketchy. So again, it became very clear he was not long for this game, but it was someone that again didn't really add that much to the show. I mean, outside of his awkwardness there, he was just kind of only shown when necessary. But again, I do think his awkwardness did lead to some fun moments. And then we get Deontay, who I really liked. Deontay was a really fun presence on this season, kind of the most faithful on the board, where it's kind of obvious that he was a faithful, but it was someone that was just seemingly genuinely kind in the game. Someone that was, again, just not really cut out for the game, but to see him at least put in this big attempt to play the game was at least interesting. Now, obviously disappointing to see him quit the game, which I believe it's because it brought up some past traumas for him. And again, just straight up, I don't think he's someone that was, like, again, really built for this game. But while he was there, again, I did find him to be a somewhat entertaining presence. But the episode isn't over just yet, as this is where we do get the reveal that the traitors are going to have the murder in plain sight. Something that they did do back in in UK season 1, and they end up doing this exact same twist in UK season 2, again, literally airing in the same night as this episode. So again, I literally saw this twice in a row, and for me personally, I feel like the US did this better, where I found this segment a lot more interesting personally, but the way they have the murder here is through finding a poison chalice in the library and then getting a faithful to drink from it, with the first faithful to drink from it being eliminated. A kind of strange way of doing the murder here, where back in UK season 1, the way they did it is by doing a kiss on the cheek that led to someone's elimination, which, I mean, in itself, maybe not the optimal way to do it, but also getting someone to drink out of your chalice is not great either, especially considering how obvious this seems to be. I mean, this is a situation where this chalice looks so different from every other cup in the house, to where you would think that when you see this and you recognize that, oh, the traitors had to murder someone, that this would have been a pretty obvious situation, though surprisingly, they do get completely away with it here. But here we do see Parvati and Dan really doing a lot of the work here, in the fact that they are the ones that get the chalice, and Parvati is the one that actually does the work to get the person murdered, where Phaedra really just does nothing throughout all of this. Though we do see Dan and Parvati plotting to initially take out Sheree, doing so under Phaedra's nose, though we do see Phaedra giving Parvati a death stare when she's close to Sheree, to where that wasn't going to go through. And beyond that, we do see talk about potentially murdering John and MJ, though really none of this ends up mattering, as really just seemed to be a pain to get anyone to drink from this chalice to begin with, to where, again, why is anyone going to drink out of this random chalice here? Leading to this pretty long sequence at the end of the episode of Parvati just going around the mansion trying to get someone to drink out of it, with us getting this big cliffhanger at the end with a lot of suspense on who she killed. So we get to episode 4, and at the beginning it's revealed that Ekin-Su was murdered, where we do see Parvati giving her drink, to which in that moment Ekin literally says, "I would never think that you're a traitor," and Parvati talks about adoring her, where supposedly they had a good relationship, which makes you question again, why murder her here? I do think this was definitely a questionable move. Obviously at the end of the day, again, they didn't have many options, so considering this and the fact that she was also someone looked at as a potential traitor, I do feel like taking out Ekin feels like a bad move, even though it actually kind of works out for him, where the confusion over why she was murdered leads to even more chaos down the road. But I will say, I do find it strange they even showed the result at the beginning of this episode, and the fact that obviously we do get this dragged out funeral scene afterwards that leads up to the eventual murder, to where I do think it potentially would have been more interesting if we didn't know who was murdered during that trek, though to be fair, there was some fun content in between this and the murder that kind of made it feel fine by the end of it. But anyway, we get to the breakfast, where everyone is going to show up to the breakfast, to the traitors' surprise, where they don't even know how this is going to properly work out, to where we do see the traitors being the first to enter, where we do see Dan and Phaedra both not knowing who was murdered, all for Parvati to come in and reveal to them that it was Ekin, to which Phaedra says, "Oh Jesus," and instantly ends up being upset, saying that this is going to put a target on her as she voted for the previous night, which doesn't really, as why would you murder someone that you voted for? That would just connect you to the murder. But Dan does say here that this is good for him and that he'll use this later, which I wonder if that'll be relevant. So also in this episode, we do have Dan talking about how he trusts Parvati more than Phaedra and that he can't win this on his own. Talks about having to put sus onto Phaedra and that he can't win the game with her in it, and also wants to use Parvati to take a shot at Phaedra. All this really strong content for Dan that was actually making me think, is there potentially that's a rebound for him? But no, it's instead setting up his elimination. But anyway, the faithful start to enter, where we do get instant talk about how they assume that MJ is murdered, how obvious of a pick she would be, only for her to eventually come in alongside Ekin-Su, to where we do get the traitors being surprised and Phaedra calling her the second coming of Jesus, to where everyone assumes that John has been murdered as he's the last one to enter, to where Alan coming in and revealing the details of the poisoning, saying that one of you were poisoned by the traitors, and that the murder was conducted in plain sight, and that by the end of this day's mission that someone will be dead. Again, an interesting concept here for sure, though realistically, I don't really love this concept of murdering in plain sight. I do feel like it is kind of underwhelming to see someone get caught doing something sketchy, like giving someone a drink or giving them a kiss on the cheek, and that's what causes them to be eliminated as a traitor. I feel like that's just kind of an underwhelming way for a traitor to go out, to not be sussed on natural means and more so be sussed because production told them to do a certain task, which to be fair doesn't play a factor on this season, but it did on like the UK seasons, and just in general, I don't particularly love that idea. But right away we see Peter's seemingly clocking how this happened, where he does ask everyone if they were given a drink, to which Ekin seems to just genuinely not remember what happened the previous night, as, again, this could have been easily deduced to Parvati right away had she remembered, though it doesn't seem to be the case. And instead, actually, the blame seems to fall onto Ekin, to where we do hear from Trishelle talking about how Ekin offered her a drink, and this leads to Ekin being a target here, with Janelle calling her a bad actor, which is obviously funny considering the later result. But here we do also have Kevin claiming that Tamra poisoned him, to which Tamra says that she would poison him because he's annoying, leading to this funny feud across this episode of Kevin versus the Bravo people, where Kevin then gets called out for eating all the food the previous night, which we get shots of him eating all the hors d'oeuvres, and we have Kevin saying in confessional that he ate too much today, which I just found really funny. But anyway, we get to the funeral mission where they have to discover the identity of the murdered player to win the mission. So we get a series of questions to find out who that person is, to where really these questions just felt pretty arbitrary. Just felt like this basic reducing to the 3 that they wanted in a coffin, which obviously was just a straight up production decision there. And again, I just feel like it's kind of underwhelming how this is handled, where it just feels like production having their hands in it a bit too much here, especially considering the fact that like Parvati was one of the 3 in the coffins. Obviously puts a bigger highlight on her, which gives her a bigger disadvantage simply because production chose her to be in the coffin. But we do get some intrigue from the questions themselves, where we do see the first question being the players are safe or born in the same year as other players, where we have MJ claiming that her husband doesn't even know her age. We have Kevin seemingly not remembering his birth year. Well, also we have Sandra giving a dig to Larsa, saying that she's surprised that her and Larsa are the same age because Larsa looks much older. But anyway, we then get to a pointless second question of who did Banana trust the most, and obviously it's the 2 challenge people, followed by a final question of essentially like who was on what team during the Scarecrow challenge, which was also pointless. To where at this point it's between MJ, Ekin, and Parvati, to where it seems pretty clear that everyone just thought it was MJ because that would be kind of the obvious move. And Janelle says it doesn't make sense to get rid of Ekin as she's so useless. And really just throughout this episode, Janelle has so many digs at so many players, or this might be the most entertainment we've gotten from Janelle since BB7. But it is also funny in the fact that we follow that up with Ekin saying that she thinks she's the one that's getting murdered here, as she's obviously a threat, showing some lack of self-awareness in that instance. But we do get the final 3 here being put into the coffins right in front of everybody, where Parvati says she feels exposed and says that if her acting was bad, the jig is up, which I believe from post-game stuff we do hear that people did suspect Parvati due to how she was acting during this challenge, where again, it's funny it's not on the show. And anyway, everyone here ends up guessing MJ, even the traitors, which obviously we get the reveal that it was instead Ekin, or we get this big shock there, to which again, like in a way works to the traitors' favor, where even Peter, who again is one of the best detectives of the season, does even claim here that he thinks it's MJ now, as it wouldn't make sense that MJ survives this round, and he does proceed to vote for MJ at the end of the episode, which again, like works to their favor to a degree, even though it shouldn't have. But anyway, with that we do lose Ekin, who again I found fun at points on the season. I mean, she was definitely this dodo figure on the season. I think through that she provides some decent content here and there. Again, her feud with Janelle was really entertaining. Her aloof content at the end here was fun. Now I think straight up, like, she's probably someone not cut out for the Traitors. Doesn't really feel like she has any acumen or really any aspect of the game, though again she was fine on the show. She definitely brought some entertainment at points, though did seem to be a pretty bad player. But with that, let's continue on the episode, where it's at this point where this episode does focus a lot around this split house dynamic, to where again it's pretty interesting to see in the Traitors, where obviously Traitors is a social deduction game, not social strategy game. However, there are social strategy aspects to it, really in the fact that again only a small number of people can actually end up winning the money, to which it was interesting to see this more social strategy style dynamic in the house here, where we do see this split between the Bravo people, to where we get this full like alliance structure being set up here, where we see the Bravo people all being together, to where we then see the likes of Janelle, CT, Dan, Parvati, and Sandra all being classified as the gamers, while we then see the faithful clique in Bergie, Trishelle, Peter, and John, to which Janelle claims that Kevin is also faithful, but a dumb faithful. But again, this is a pretty interesting alliance breakdown here that I will say, like, in a way does feel a bit rudimentary in the fact that it's obviously essentially the Bravo people versus the people that come from competitive reality shows, with essentially the stragglers in the middle. But again, it does lead to some intrigue here, where we do see Sandra talking about how her strat is to become closer to the housewives, and we see her bonding with Larsa. Oh, well, Larsa seems to be running the Bravo side side of things. So we do see Janelle and Parvati both talk about targeting Larsa, with Parvati putting a lot of work into getting suspicion on her, which plays off of their rivalry back in episode 1. So this leads to Larsa becoming a main target here, to where we then see Larsa campaigning to the other women, saying that we should vote for a man, saying that it's not Bergie and Kevin isn't smart enough to be a traitor, which they are between Dan and CT, to where she claims that she thinks CT is the alpha here, that he's the one getting rid of the big guys, which does seem to be pretty detrimental here, where CT seemed to be playing a pretty good social game, where a lot of people just wanted CT still in the game, where we literally see Sandra here talk about how she's loyal to CT, and this leads to her going around and turning the votes on Larsa as well, where we see her going to Dan and telling him to vote for Larsa, to where it became clear that Larsa was the pretty clear target coming into the roundtable, to where when we get there, we do see Janelle calling her out for leading a cheer for Marcus, which seems to be the point that they're assuming that the poisoning happened, which seems misguided considering that was obviously like early in the day. I don't know why they would have thought it would have happened that early, but it does lead to this fun bickering between Janelle and Larsa, where Janelle says the cheer was weird and Larsa says you're weird, how you're selfish is weird, which just felt like this very petty back and forth. But here we do see Larsa calling out CT, saying that he's the head of the snake, which again just seems to lose her even more favor there. And here we do also get some pretty fun banter from Kevin, who says her theory doesn't make sense, and instead wants to vote for MJ, only for NJ to retort that, saying that you're threatened by the alpha men, only for Kevin to say he's not, and that if he was a traitor, he would get rid of her, and he finds her highly annoying, which is all funny content. But then we get a lot of focus on Parvati, where Parvati does talk here about how the people who are traitors are more likely people that can act, and who can act housewives, which ends up really upsetting Phaedra here, linked to fun content from them, where I just love the way that Phaedra says, don't do that, Parvati. Anyway, we get to the vote, where obviously the gamers here end up voting for Larsa, while the housewives end up voting for Kevin, but a lot of the votes in the middle end up going for Larsa as well, to where she's voted out. She's obviously a faithful. So we do get some more drama with the housewives bickering with Parvati for a little bit, and we do see Phaedra talking about wanting to vote for Parvati and doesn't know what she's thinking, putting heat on her, which, I mean, again, should be pretty obvious here. Like, I do feel like Phaedra, despite playing probably the better, like, social game within the house, I do think it's someone that was very much lacking in terms of this cutthroat nature as a traitor, where it just seemed like she was blindly loyal to the traitors and willing to go to the end with them, despite the fact that no one else really wanted to go to the end with her. But again, we do get some drama at the traitors meeting, where you see Phaedra really coming for Parvati there, saying that it wasn't cool to throw her under the bus, and says that no one likes you, Parvati, and everyone knows that you're a traitor. And we get this big cliffhanger, and how is this going to resolve, only for it to lead to nothing, which was kind of underwhelming. But again, really great moment there. And again, the first like inclination that people are really sussing Parvati, which again wasn't really focused on the show until this following episode. But again, we get to episode 5 where Parvati apologizes and everything's just fine. That was kind of underwhelming. But Parvati does say that as an offer of goodwill, she's going to let Phaedra decide who goes home here, to which she talks about how her two options are Sandra and Tamra, which were two random options here, and she decides to kill Tamra, which, why? Again, this is such a questionable decision from Phaedra. Obviously killing a housewife here, one person that is very much on her side, and like obviously there is benefit to that. Again, killing someone that's closer to you and make people suspect you less, as they're going to be like, why would you kill that person? But we've literally seen on this season people suspect Larsa, despite the fact that that would mean that she had to kill her own boyfriend, where I don't think that really gains you anything. I think having Tamra as a loyal number was a lot more important here. Now, straight up, I would not be shocked if Dan and Parvati just did not allow her to murder Sandra, but I do feel like Tamra was just such a terrible option for her. But yeah, with that, let's talk about the boots here. Obviously, we did lose Larsa, who was really great TV on this season. Someone that was obviously this like leader figure for the Bravo people, and mixing that in the fact that she lost Marcus early on and was on to Dan. I do think she brought a lot to the show here. I do like that she was at least a very active player, which again is better than a lot of the other housewives on this show. So I do think outside of Phaedra, I think out of the housewives, I think she's definitely the one that brought the most to the show. And it was kind of disappointing to see her go out as early as she did, though, again, not unexpected. But with that, we didn't also lose Tamra, who did not bring as much to the show. Now, she's not entirely a dud. I do feel like she, again, had this bickering with John. She also had this hatred for Kevin that was pretty fun. But as a whole, like, I don't feel like she was the greatest TV on this season. But she wasn't necessarily bad either. Again, she's just kind of a passable casting choice. And really, again, not the worst housewife on this season, entertainment-wise, which we'll talk about. But anyway, we get to the breakfast, this, where obviously Tamara is murdered, and while everyone's shocked over that, we have this cut to Phaedra just constantly asking, are there any boiled eggs, which is humorous. But this is where we start to get a lot of focus on Peter, where Peter does talk about how there has to be a guy in the Traitors and that he thinks it's Dan, thinking that the Traitors are Dan, CT, and Parvati, and getting 2 of the 3 right. All CT asked Dan, leading to more sus landing on Dan, where we do see CT asking Dan for a theory, to which Dan just doesn't say a name here and says that he doesn't want to show his cards yet, which I am largely conflicted on how Dan plays this. Obviously, this is not optimal. Obviously, when everyone's going around talking about how little you're talking, that's not good. But also, I think for him to shake it up here, start to go the opposite route, is also kind of bad too. And then mixing that with his reputation, I do think if he were to come in and be this big player, I do feel like he would also be targeted there. So again, despite the fact that I don't think many people knew who Dan was coming into this season, it does seem like people just had this knowledge about him being a 2-time Big Brother winner, to where I do feel like there definitely was a stigma against him early on, to where I don't really know how Dan should play this season. I think he was kind of just screwed either way. But obviously, at this point where people are begging him to say a name and he doesn't say anything, it does just continue to make him look pretty sketchy. But anyway, again, we do see the quote-unquote faithful group agree on the fact that they think it's obvious that it's Dan, to where Janelle now talks about targeting him, while Dan talks about how she's someone that he thinks is dangerous in the game, clearly setting up this battle between the two that ends up culminating in this episode. But anyway, we get to the mission where they're told to split into the groups of 2, one on the inside and one on the outside, with the reveal that the players on the outside are the only ones that can win the shield. To which we do get a lot of bickering over who gets to be on the outside. Either way, the outside players end up working in pairs, where they have to run around and find these different bird calls and then imitate them to the players inside, to where they have to find the right bird statues. A really ridiculous concept for a challenge, though also one that actually kind of ended up being pretty fun, where it was just ridiculous to see these reality stars doing these bird impersonations as they're running around searching for these statues, where we even get these shots of Alan mocking them as they do so. Particularly a lot of focus on John as he's scampering around, and we get this moment that I found so funny of Sandra just running around yelling, it sounds like it's a dog but it's not. But through this we also get this more focus on the Phaedra CT relationship, with her talking about how silly he is, and we get this one shot of him running around while flailing his arms, which was funny. But an added aspect of this challenge is that the pairs that are outside can also go to the center of the area, to which in doing so they can do a bird call to win shields for both of them, adding this dilemma of, again, going for money for the entire group or going for the shield, which it is really funny how it plays out here, where we do see Peter and Janelle and Kevin and Sheree both want to go for the shields, though end up getting lost on the way there, all while Trishelle and Berkey initially don't go for the shields, only to decide to go for it after making some money for the group, to which they somehow end up being the first pair there and getting the shields in that instance, really meaning the other 2 teams must have really sucked. But this is where we again get a lot of focus on Peter, where Peter does talk about now creating a plan for the entire group to not tell anyone who has the shield, and that gives them all implicit immunity, a plan that's simply just common sense and us seeing this utilized on many other versions of the show. So the edit really ends up hyping up Peter for this as if he's some sort of mastermind, but I do think what was the more interesting move is part 2 of this plan, which we see end up happening a bit later, where we do see Peter then using this info against the people he thinks are traitors, telling Dan, Parvati, and CT that he has the shield in a way to lure them into murdering Bergie or Trishelle, to which if they do so and no one ends up being murdered, that essentially ends up guaranteeing that one of those 3 must be the traitor, as why else take that risk, which I do feel like I've seen this somewhat attempted in the past, but I do think it's an interesting move here that does show Peter playing the game way more intellectually than I was expecting. Again, it should have been very see-through, even though it didn't seem to be for certain people, but either way, it became very clear this plan was going to work out for him, considering how propped up Peter was getting in the edit here for it. But beyond that, again, lead up to the round table, we do see Janelle campaigning for Dan, which I should say, I don't even know why she's going for Dan, where, the optimal move for the Traitors is not constantly voting out the traitors, but instead figuring out who the traitors are and then building a strong bond with that traitor and then cutting them at the very end. That is the optimal strat for a faithful. And Janelle should have been doing that with Dan here. Again, they have a previous relationship. She knew he was a traitor, yet instead she decides to target him, which again just seemed like a very misguided play. And this is all while other people start to suspect Janelle, where do you see Kevin talk about targeting Janelle, saying that it's either she's a traitor or a sloppy faithful, and that her being gone will allow them to make better decisions, which is kind of a weird rationale. But here we also see MJ targeting Janelle, which is really humorous, as again, she was just coming for Dan. For her to now give up on that to target Janelle is pretty insane. So we literally see her even go to Dan and tell him that he's being targeted, which we do see Dan being a bit nervous coming into the round table, though I do feel like it was pretty clear it was more so leaning in the Janelle side of things. But anyway, at the round table, we do find out about a twist, showing a player getting an invitation and saying that player is arriving, with the reveal that player is Kate Chastain from season 1 for some reason. And Kate was a lot of fun on season 1. I think she was a great character there, but I really don't know why she's here. Where, I mean, for me, Kate is someone that, again, like, hated her experience on season 1 and didn't even want to be there, didn't even really properly play the game, kind of was just sabotaging everyone else, which, to be fair, I guess that's what they wanted from her on this season. But I just question, why bring her back if she didn't even want to be there the first time? And obviously she's here because of the money, like, obviously that's her incentive for coming back. But I just find this overall twist kind of underwhelming, especially because, like, I also don't love this aspect of adding in people late into a social deduction game, where while obviously she could have been added as a faithful or a traitor, I do feel like more than likely they're going to be added in as a faithful, especially in this instance where they haven't caught a traitor yet, which kind of made her an obvious faithful, while also mixing that into the fact that you're just coming in with a lot less information, where again, like, almost half the game has been played at this point, with her missing out on all that context. And she even gets about this roundtable despite having no info. Again, just all this feels really strange. I didn't particularly like how any of this was handled, but either way, Kate does bring some fun right away, where she ends up asking, who do we hate? Leading to this really fun moment from Kevin, where Kevin says that he wants to state his case without being interrupted, only for us to lead up to a later moment where Kate ends up asking MJ who he is. And Kevin gets upset that she isn't listening, which again is just funny that Kevin creates this feud with her like right away on this season. But either way, Kevin ends up obviously throwing out Janelle, with Janelle then rebutting and saying that it's Dan and CT, saying that they're acting strange, but then also proceeds to call out Sandra as the third, which really just in general, like, she's calling out too many people. I mean, this is such a bad strat on the Traitors to be openly targeting numerous people in this way, where it's obviously turning all of them against you while also making you come off as an unreliable source if you're wronged, which again, it seemed like many people did not think it was CT or Sandra, which kind of makes her come off as unreliable and her making an even bigger target of herself. But again, after this, we do see Peter once again talk about how there has to be one guy and thinks that it's Dan, as he's contributed the least, to which we then see Dan try to do his typical thing to Kate, saying, you don't know me, and says, I like to wait for the evidence, and talking directly to her, and again, very clearly trying to gain her favor for the vote, only for her to then proceed to say, who was saying, you like to win everything, which again shows the reputation that he had coming into this season. But obviously Janelle ends up then coming for Dan, saying that he's done nothing, and asks him who he thinks the traitor is, to which Dan now says Janelle, which he then gets fake emotional when saying that I can't move forward with you in this game, and says that I've been defending you and I shouldn't have. And all this felt very performative, obviously. Like, this felt very reminiscent to tactics he would use in his Big Brother game. Though again, it seems to be somewhat effective here, where while we do see the votes being split between Dan and Janelle, once again Dan ends up winning this battle, with Janelle getting voted out here. So she obviously says, I'm a faithful, you idiots. Though I'll be remiss if I didn't mention probably one of my favorite moments in this entire season, a moment that was so surreal to me, and the fact that during the voting, when Sandra ends up voting for Janelle, we get this incredible bickering between the two, and just have this back and forth of them saying, you're a traitor, only for Janelle to end that with, you're a traitor, bitch. And Sandra says, fuck off, and Janelle says, you fuck off. Again, this really incredible back and forth that, again, was just so surreal to see these two icons of reality TV going after each other in this way. But I mean, with this, we do end up losing Janelle, and obviously Janelle brought a lot to the season. As I mentioned, I do think Janelle is probably the most entertaining she's been here since BB7, where again, both of her runs on BB14 and 22 were obviously short-lived, but I think here she brought some pretty good TV. Again, her really cutting confessionals were really fun to see, and she was playing the game super aggressively, and again, like, pretty much playing it all wrong for the most part. But again, I do love how aggressively she was going for the shields, the fact that she seemed to be a pretty central figure in the house and trying to get some of these earlier votes together, and again, just in general, like, was a pretty big player player on this season. But really, I feel like her run this season went as well as I would have wanted it to go from an entertainment standpoint. But anyway, the episode's not done just yet, where right before the players go to sleep, we do see Peter telling Dan to speak up, to where Dan says that if he survives tonight, he'll take a shot tomorrow, which seems like clear setup to him throwing a traitor under the bus, even if the later situation didn't happen. But it's in this instance where Bergie tells him that your name's already on my chalkboard, setting up the traitors meeting, where here we do see Dan saying that he let the others have the murders, but today he's going in aggressive and he needs to pick who gets murdered here, to which he wants to murder Bergie, which is just a terrible move, where again, Dan is the best Big Brother player of all time. I don't think that's disputed. For me, that doesn't really change from this season, but I mean, this was definitely a bad look for Dan. Again, it shows him having a complete misread on the game. Again, he just thinks that Peter was being truthful somehow, which doesn't even make sense considering Peter literally votes for him. So why would Peter be telling him truthful information, which even Parvati recognizes this and says that he must have been lying, as Wally tell those that he doesn't trust. Again, a basic read to me, again, feeling like a read similar to her read on Amanda during the double idol play, which again, I never personally found that impressive of a read. And again, it feels similar here, where again, it should be pretty obvious, though we see Dan not recognizing that and just underestimating Peter and thinking that Peter's not smart enough to pull over something on him, which again, felt like this obviously very clear downfall for Dan. But again, just feels like a read that Dan should have been easily able to suss out here. And instead, it ends up just dooming his game to where it felt near impossible for him to get out of this situation coming into the following round. Where we get to episode 6, where we started off with voiceover confirming that Bergie had the shield and was not murdered, which was a weird way of handling this, especially considering, again, it was kind of left on a cliffhanger at the end of episode 5. So weird for episode 6 to literally start with them just telling us the resolution. But anyway, we get to the breakfast where Dan talks about taking a huge risk in killing Bergie, as everyone's going to pin the murder on him, to where we literally already see Dan talking about how he thinks the person murdered is going to be someone that voted for him, clearly setting it up there in an instance where, again, it should have been so obvious that Dan was a traitor at this point, in that he already knew that Bergie was murdered and that's why he's saying this. But anyway, we also see Phaedra being frustrated that Bergie was killed, as she was very close to Bergie, which does make you question again, why is Phaedra going through this? She's really just taking out her own numbers. And again, it works out for her because he ends up getting saved here and he ends up supporting her over Dan in their upcoming feud. But again, it's just funny how that kind of happens by accident. But anyway, obviously Bergie is safe for last, to where Phaedra then says, "I love my burgerlicious," which is really a nothing line, though somehow this ends up being important down the road. But Bergie then comes in and the traitors are shocked here, to where he reveals he had the shield and had clearly been told that the traitors tried to murder him, which I didn't remember that being the way this worked, in that I just assumed that he would come into breakfast not knowing that fact, but it seemed like he just instantly knew it, to where it would not be shocked if there was this scene of him getting the letter, though they just ended up cutting it from the show. But in this instance, we instantly see Peter being happy, saying "game on," and tells Trishelle that we got him being so smug in this instance, like openly saying checkmate and revealing his plan to everyone at the table, saying that he only told Dan, Parvati, and CT, and that Dan and Parvati's faces, and that Dan and Parvati had big reactions while CT didn't react, so he thinks it's Dan and Parvati, which again, he is right in this instance, though this is followed up by content from Parvati saying that she's upset that she's exposed and blames it all on Dan, though does say that she still has power and will reclaim it, mark her words, which again felt like this very good content for Parvati. We get to the mission, which ends up being a very physical challenge here, of them having to carry a catapult to the top of a hill, and along the way they have shield boxes that players can pick up for the chance of winning a shield, with Peter talking about how he needs it because it's so obvious that they would murder him, which I'm too fair kind of is. Still, it does play into his like inflated ego at this point in the game. But we do get this funny moment here of them having to cross a river, and we have Trishelle and Kevin crossing together, to where we see Trishelle dragging him into a shield box, which was a funny visual. But again, they end up completing the mission, and we do get this mini challenge following this of the players that got the boxes getting to shoot a target, and the person that's closest to the target ends up winning a challenge that seems to have no skill to it, and Trey wins. So that's something. But following this, we obviously get a lot of setup to the round table, where we do get this very awkward conversation between Peter and Parvati, with her proclaiming that he must be a traitor due to how much he's throwing people's names out. Parvati saying that it's his mission to get her out of the game, clearly setting up this very interesting dynamic between the two of them, to where we later get this moment of Parvati trying to enter a room where all the faithfuls are talking, and he ends up kicking her out, to where she calls him holier than thou. Though it is interesting that in this moment, Peter does say that he's not 100% about Dan, but knows for sure that it's Parvati. He says that she doesn't like the game that he's playing, and now is making her goal to break his group apart and is targeting them, which is pretty solid content for her. Oh, well, we then get Dan's perspective where he talks about how the plan backfired on him, and he says the time for passive play is over, and we see his conversation with Peter talking about what went wrong, to where Peter literally says that you were always in my top 3 and there's really nothing you could do. To where it is funny that Dan literally says that, oh, I thought it was weird that you told me that, and I thought it was because we were tight. It's like, I mean, he literally voted for you, but here Dan knows that he's pretty much screwed coming into the round table. Though he does talk about how he'll never quit and that he'll bring up a decent argument at the round table, telling Peter that there's one person he's 100% on and will reveal that at the round table, clearly setting up that he'll go after one of his fellow traitors, to where we get to the round table where Dan does give off this massive show, very reminiscent to replacement nominee roulette and Dan's funeral, where he talks about how he's been watching one person since day one and it's time for that to come out. And he's been collecting information and that we should play a little game. Again, just being up to his old tricks of asking everyone who's had their name written down. To in a sense, it's not those people because we have to look at the least sus people. And of those, he says, we have to look at the voting pattern, saying that Sandra has always explained herself. Bergie just goes with the crowd. Sheree had a weird vote with John, but explained it, I guess. Obviously narrows it down to Phaedra and Parvati, only to then say that Parvati's only vote out of the norm was for Kevin and that she explained it. Again, I guess. That leaves for one person, and he's targeting Phaedra, saying that Phaedra has never explained her vote for Ekin-Su, and then Ekin-Su got murdered, and talks about her over-the-top breakfast reactions, from calling Bergie burgerlicious, and her consoling Larsa when Marcus was murdered. And this is just ridiculous, straight up. Like, I love Dan. I think Dan is still the best Big Brother player of all time. This is a terrible argument. And to be fair, I do think he recognized that he didn't have much of a chance anyway, and was really just going out on a limb, but this makes no sense, where none of these arguments really hold much weight. And obviously, yeah, he knows that Phaedra is a traitor, but nothing here really makes sense. And we see it's instantly rebutted. Like, no one takes this well. And it does make you question, like, why is he targeting Phaedra here? Obviously, Parvati would have been the much easier target. I think there is definitely a chance he could have gotten Parvati out, at least keeping him in the game from one more round. But again, he does talk about post-show about how he thought he needed Parvati in the game and didn't trust Phaedra. But again, it once again just shows a misread on him. I mean, Phaedra supposedly was loyal to him and did want to go to the end with him. And he talks about how he never even considered the fact that they could go to the end together and share the prize money. And again, just shows Dan having a bit of a misread in this game, where again, it just feels like he played this all wrong here. And in essence, ends up dragging Phaedra down with him. So while it doesn't lead to Phaedra getting voted out over him here, it does lead to Phaedra being more of a target down the road. But Dan does question her here about why'd you vote out Ekin-Su, to which she just easily rebuts that and then calls her out for saying burgerlicious, to which Kate ends up mocking that argument. And obviously here we have Phaedra really just retorting everything that Dan ends up saying here, answering his questions very diligently, and ends up saying that I do too much because you do too little, claiming why would she murder Bergie? And Bergie supports her here, saying that she would keep him long game if she was smart, and says no one trusts you, darling, and really just demolishes him here. There again, like, coming out of this season, it is pretty insane to see the likes of Phaedra Parks and Pilot Pete end up outplaying Dan in this instance. But it's at this point where Parvati does take a bit more of the forefront, where she does talk about how there's a strong clique in this game and does try to rally those not in the clique, where Bergie and Peter instantly call this out as the traitors trying to separate them and says stay strong here. So Parvati then tries to give her excuse for having trusted Dan, and Peter just interrupts her, to which Parvati says can I finish, and that it doesn't feel good to be falsely accused. So again, this feud between Parvati and Peter was just really fun here. But again, we get to the vote where it is a unanimous Dan vote, the only vote opposing coming from Peter, outside of Peter, who ends up voting for Parvati, just as a reminder that she's also a traitor. And it's also in this moment where we get probably another one of my favorite moments of the entire season, where we get John's speech when voting out Dan, saying, I listened intently to you, Dan, tonight, and your deflection was onto Phaedra, and that case was comprehensively rebutted. Treachery deserves to be punished by banishment. Banishment, my dear friend, should be your fate tonight. And proceeds to say that this guy is the silent slaughterer, which again, very clearly felt kind of tacked on there, but again, all a really funny speech there. One of my favorite moments of the season. But obviously in this instance, Dan is revealed as a traitor, to which we do get a pretty tepid reaction to this, considering how everyone just knew he was a traitor by this point. And we didn't have Phaedra just saying bye over and over again to him. But again, this this entire situation did seem to add sus onto Phaedra, where Trishelle does state that she thinks that Dan knew that they had defeated a traitor and now thinks that Phaedra is a traitor because of that, setting up her downfall. But again, with all this, we obviously lose Dan. And again, like as I said, I think Dan is still the best Big Brother player of all time. I don't think his role on the Traitors really plays any factor into my assessment of his Big Brother game, in the same way that I look at Cody as well. Like straight up, I do look at the Traitors and Big Brother as very different games. I mean, the Traitors is a social deduction game. It's not a social strategy game. I think Dan's strategy of just being under the radar and slowly building these one-on-one bonds, again, that is a very effective strategy on Big Brother, but simply just not on the Traitors. And it felt like Dan was just trying to play the game the same way, which again just simply doesn't work here. And again, his reaction to him being targeted was simply not great here. Again, he showed some bad reads. He simply, again, did not play this well. And I do think really coming out of this, I think he is up there one of the worst Traitors we've seen. I mean, I think probably still better than some of these that get taken out immediately. And again, considering the fact that Dan had a pretty big reputation coming into this season, I do think it's impressive that he even made it as far as he did. And he literally made it halfway through the season, but still, I just find his actual play within it to be pretty suboptimal. But again, obviously still made for great TV. Again, still the showman that he was back on Big Brother. And again, it was still a fever dream to even see him on the show to begin with. But with that, we then conclude the episode with the Traitors meeting, where we do talk about how they could do the obvious and murder Peter, only for Parvati to say that's not enough to save her. So we then get the reveal that they now have the opportunity to recruit, with Parvati talking about now wanting to roll the dice and seduce Peter instead, turning the tables on the people that he's working with. And straight up, I think this is probably the optimal strat for Parvati. I mean, Parvati is in this situation where she's screwed anyway. She's probably the next vote out if something doesn't change. And by recruiting Peter, obviously there's at least the chance there that Peter now stumps for her and gets his own allies to get off her back. But even if that doesn't happen, it now will become sus of why isn't Peter being murdered, as he's just such an obvious person to be murdered at this point. And the longer he stays in the game, the more sus there's going to be on him, to where I do feel like for Parvati, again, in this situation where it seems like she's pretty much screwed either way, I do think this was probably the optimal route to take. Even though obviously there's also this added notion of Peter could use this info that she's a traitor even further against her and then could further throw her under the bus. But again, that was kind of what he was going to do anyway. So I do think this is probably the optimal move for her. And also just TV wise is also really fun as well, as she even mentioned this herself, that it's fun to see this person who is the most blue blood detective have to turn against his own people and have to murder his friends. Where we do see them recruiting Peter, to which we do get a cliffhanger at the end of the episode, which, I mean, you would assume that he would accept, as there's not really much other option, theoretically, which you would think if he says no, that he's just going to be murdered the following round, as that's the obvious thing that just happens to be able to reject traitor offers, to where we get to episode 7, where it's revealed that he refused the offer, saying that he's faithful to the end and that he can't betray his team and that he wants to win the game in the right way, obviously being on a massive high horse there. And it is funny that even Parvati does call him a dummy here, and again, this is pretty dumb. This is really just Peter thinking he's on this massive moral high ground, when this makes no sense for his game, and he should be really screwed moving forward. But coming into the breakfast, we do have Parvati saying that she'll rise above the ashes and find a way to march on, setting her up in a pretty terrible position in the game where she should be easily voted off in the next vote off. Though we do get some intrigue from the breakfast itself, where obviously no one ends up getting murdered here, and we do see Parvati talking about wanting Peter to talk about the recruitment, as they'll put a target on his back, though Peter ends up not doing so, seeming to clock the fact that it was Parvati that tried to recruit him, and then proceeds to tell John that he's going to tell him something later, again clearly wanting to keep this information as a secret from anyone outside of his core alliance, which I'm kind of mixed on this move as a whole. Like, I feel like there's pros and cons to doing so, though I don't really gripe with this decision too much, even though I do think it's just more so indication of how Peter is playing the game so rigidly in this instance, of being just so loyal to his one specific group. But again, this does lead to some fun from Parvati calling out that there's a new traitor in the house, with obviously no one ending up admitting to them getting a letter. Though I do think Parvati really making a show of all this, and obviously very clearly trying to put the target onto Peter's back, is something that again like seemed to be somewhat effective, as we do see Peter become a target by the end of this episode. But I also don't think it's a good look. I think it just kind of makes it clear that she is a traitor, as really the way she acts throughout this episode very much comes off as she knows she's caught and she's just trying to squeak on by. So I feel like there would be absolutely no doubt doubt that she's a traitor at this point in the game. Though, to be fair, again, that was probably the case coming into the round anyway. But again, I do think if I were in the game, I would be assuming that Peter had been recruited and Parvati had recruited him just to throw him under the bus instantly based on the way she's acting, which, to be fair, again, if that's intentional, then good on her. But I'm just not entirely sure if that's actually the way she's thinking about this situation. But either way, Peter ends up calling together his group and revealing that he turned down the invitation, but still being very gung-ho on the fact that they need to take out Parvati tonight. So to which Rochelle ends up rejecting this plan, saying that Parvati is a wounded bird and has nobody, while Phaedra has everybody on their side, leading to some bickering over which plan is better, which ends up not mattering for this episode. But anyway, Phaedra ends up entering the room, to which Peter ends up kicking her out. Again, very much coming off as like Peter having this like HOH-itis on the Traitors, which I mean, obviously we've seen him do with Parvati, but I mean, the fact that he's like literally doing this with everybody, even the people that he isn't as convinced are traitors, is really humorous here, as we do see Phaedra go to the other room that literally has everyone else in it and complains about him, leading to MJ trying to get into the room herself, only for her to get even frostier reception from Peter, who then proceeds to lock the door after she leaves. This does lead to Sandra returning to the show, saying that Peter is a traitor and that he's using his big alliance to run the game, which does proceed to say it's a numbers game, and then starts to tell the group her theory using pool balls, which was kind of funny. But then again, continues to talk about the game here as if it's something like Survivor, and talking about how she needs the leftovers to take out this other big faction in the game, which in essence essentially does protect the traitors in this game. Though I don't think this is actually a bad move for Sandra. I mean, while the Traitors is a social deduction game at its core, I mean, the goal of the game is to get the end as a faithful without any traitors there is still a social strategy aspect to the game, particularly in the fact that only at most 4 people can win this show. And through that, there is this need for this social strategy aspect of the game in needing to make sure the numbers are set up in a way for you to get to the end in that way. To where while this is all based around a bad read from Sandra, I actually do think this is pretty strong play from Sandra in trying to lead the charge against Peter in this instance to, again, guarantee that her side has numbers over him to make it more likely that she gets to the end. But again, it very much did feel like we were set up for this big Peter blindside in this episode, which would have been this really cool prospect, though none of that really fully comes to be here. But and we do get to the mission where, as them being paired up and having to hike through the woods with bags of money and having to answer questions to get to the end, and if both members of the pair are eliminated, they lose the money for their group. Again, mostly identical to the Traitors UK version of this challenge, though interestingly they changed the way that the shield was divvied out here, where it had previously been a dilemma that the players had to make, while here they didn't do that and just gave it away to the fastest pair, which, to be fair, I think is a clear change up due to the fact they didn't really work out particularly well in the UK, and considering the later format of this round, they really needed somebody to have the shield, but at the end they didn't really have a great impact on the challenge. But the challenge itself did end up being fun still, where Peter and Trishelle ended up being a pair and ended up being really cocky and picking the biggest bag of gold because they're obviously the best team, only for them to unshockingly lose it all, with Peter even getting the first question wrong, and to see him fall in the mud is all pretty funny, where obviously if you fail a question here, you get caught in a trap, either a pool of mud or caught in a net, which was a humorous visual there. But the only 2 pairs to finish here ended up being Sandra and Kevin, and Parvati and John, thus seeing Parvati have to guide John the entire way, all while Sandra ran out of steam and had to be helped by Kevin towards the end. But shockingly, Kevin and Sandra end up winning this challenge, meaning Sandra's finally won a challenge. It's a miracle. But following this, we do get a short sequence back at the mansion that does start off with CT putting on the armor and shield from a knight statue and starts walking around in it, which was a ridiculous visual, though this does lead to CT confirming in confessional that, yeah, the vote is on Peter and he would be voting out Peter, though does proceed to then warn Peter for some reason, leading to Peter scrambling and finally getting into a room with just the traitors, which I remembered the scene from the trailer that had me pretty convinced that Peter was going to accept and that this was some sort of traitors meeting, but no, instead it's Peter just campaigning for himself and asking to work together with Parvati, only for Phaedra to then leave the room, saying she doesn't want anything to do with this sort of stuff. But again, it's this great setup to the round table, only for it to all lead to nothing, as Alan calls the players together to where they're told to meet in the woods in 10 minutes, leading up to a pretty lame twist where we get the reveal that the traitors will still get to murder someone tonight, though the remaining players have the power to decide who will be spared, aka meaning that this is a non-elimination episode, or this has them doing a safety chain, because every reality show has to do a safety chain at this point, in order to determine who can be murdered, which again just holds the momentum that this episode had going for it. And while this does provide drama in its own right, I don't feel it was really worth taking away this really interesting vote off that could have happened otherwise. And I do feel like it made for lesser TV here, but again, still fun in its own right, where you see Kevin and Sandra starting off the chain, where MJ talks about knowing that Sandra will save her because I guess they're close, which we've never seen up to this point, but instead they end up saving Sheree, which was random. Either way, Sheree then proceeds to save Phaedra, leading to their relationship finally getting formally focused on the show, with Phaedra getting emotional, talking about having known each other for 20 years, being this nice personal content for her, only for Phaedra to then save CT, which ends up upsetting Parvati, who thought she was going to be saved, which is kind of dumb, as why would she blow up her spot like that? But this leads to this other big dramatic choice here of CT having Trishelle really wanting him to pick her, to where she feels really confident in the fact that he's going to, as they've obviously been repairing their relationship. And really throughout this entire sequence, Trishelle is really begging every single person to pick her, only be passed up on. And what do you know? CT ends up picking John instead, talking about how John's occupation and skills make him more useful to the faithfuls, I guess. Even though, again, like at the end of the day, I do think this is people being a bit too focused on the social deduction aspects of the game. Anyway, John now has the final choice here, to where he's between Peter and Trishelle, with both of them begging him to pick them. To where Parvati talks about needing Peter to not get picked, as they need to murder him now for some reason. Again, you would think that she would want to keep him around at this point, as he seems like someone that could potentially be targeted, but John obviously ends up saving him. To which Sandra does say that she does have a bit of a change of mind now, recognizing how nervous he was, which, I mean, to be fair, maybe that was just an easy read to have here, and that is more of a reason why Parvati wanted to murder him, because he kind of proved he was more faithful in this instance. But anyway, we do return to the castle, where MJ and Trishelle end up airing their frustrations with those that didn't save them, with a lot of focus on the Trishelle CT relationship once again. Either way, we obviously get to the Traitors meeting, where we do see tension between Parvati and Phaedra, with both expressing their distrust in each other, while we do see Phaedra calling out Parvati for acting like an ice princess, and ends up imitating her and tells her to soften her heart, which was all pretty funny content. But obviously we get the lead up to the murder, with very few options here, where I do think it was actually kind of an interesting decision, where obviously you could take out one of Peter's henchmen in Bergie or Trishelle and give less power to that side, though taking out a number on that side over a number on your own side, like someone like MJ or Kate, would actually make you more expendable number for your own side. As if you take out a number from your own side, the numbers will be a bit tighter, to where you would think it would essentially force the new form majority to stick together for at least one more round. But again, I do think this is an interesting decision here, though none of this ended up really mattering, as all these dynamics don't even carry on to the following episode anyway. But again, we do see them end up deciding on Bergie. And Bergie is someone that, again, I came out of this pretty impressed by. I do think he came into the season looking like this naive kid. He's the youngest person of this cast by quite a bit. And because I really did not expect much from him, I thought he was just going to be aloof the entire time. But again, he actually played pretty competently. Again, he was one of the better faithfuls on the board. Again, recognizing who the traitors are. Now, again, in terms of navigation through the game, he could have definitely done a lot better. He was a bit too open in his opinions and was too close to Peter. That made him a target. But I think as a whole, again, he very much did impress me here, to where he definitely ended up being a much better player than I was expecting. But with that, we then get to episode 8, where we start off with the breakfast, where obviously there's open talk here about how Parvati is the traitor, to where it very much did feel like Parvati was set up to go for most of this episode, especially considering how much they set up this Phaedra plan in the early portions of the episode and never end up really showing how the numbers were coming together for that plan, to where it kind of made it obvious to me that this was more so a red herring. Though funnily here, we do see some animosity for Peter, with most of the faithfuls being annoyed at how he's acting, and Phaedra saying that if you're going to be Sherlock, be a nice Sherlock, not Sherlock the Dick, which was a humorous line. But this episode ends up starting a lot of focus on Trishelle, where before the mission, we do see Trishelle saying that Parvati is the safest bet, but she thinks that Phaedra is a traitor, calling out numerous tells from her, and her not throwing out names, and her having a twitch in her eye, and says that Phaedra is more dangerous than Parvati, considering Phaedra has more numbers. Obviously a similar campaign than what she did the previous round, though this time it seemingly works. It gets Peter on board. So while their alliance at this point is very clearly outnumbered, it does lead to their alliance targeting Phaedra for this round. Something that I think for Peter is a questionable move. I do think it is not a great look for him to have been previously so gung-ho on taking out Parvati, only for him to then shift to Phaedra all of a sudden here. And while again, I do think it is probably the optimal move in terms of navigation through the game, in the sense that Phaedra is much more dangerous as a traitor than Parvati is, or Parvati has no numbers. Phaedra has many loyal numbers. I do think at the end of the day, it's a move that, considering his position in the game at this point, is suboptimal, largely because of how gung-ho he was for Parvati previously, which is kind of the issue of how he plays the game to begin with. But this is where we do see Peter going to Parvati, and with him now needing her number and also wanting to keep himself safe with the knowledge that Parvati is probably going to stay in the game, we do see him calling a truce with her and gets her agree to go for Phaedra, where again at this point just felt like the Phaedra vote was just too obvious, with us not really seeing the perspective of the actual important votes for this vote in the likes of CT and Sandra, that just made this vote not feel like a practicality. But anyway, we do get to the mission, which ends up being an escape room challenge of them being locked into a cabin, having to find their way through the tunnels to get out, to which this cabin has a guest, and that guest is Dr. Will, for some reason. To which, I mean, again, cool to see Dr. Will on TV, I guess, but why? I mean, this was pointless. I mean, what a waste of money from the Traitors to really pay him to show up here in a position where, again, it's so underwhelming considering the fact that none of the Big Brother players are left in the game. Janelle and Dan, who obviously have history with him, again, to not see their interactions is disappointing. And beyond that, like, most people don't seem to know who he is. And really, he brought nothing to the show either. This could have easily just been Alan and it would have made no difference. So again, this is definitely a very underwhelming appearance here, especially considering how it was pretty hyped up earlier on in the season. But again, this was just a mostly boring challenge, but the one little bit of intrigue that came from it is more being added to the Trishelle CT relationship, where they end up finding a shield together here, and we do see their relationship progress through CT deciding to make it up to her by giving her the shield. But really, again, outside that, it was just a largely boring challenge here. But beyond that, in the lead up to the round table, we do see Parvati going on the campaign trail, going to John, where they're talking about needing his number as he's the most faithful of the faithfuls, and we see her getting emotional, saying that when under attack she becomes icy and walls off, and talks about the struggle she's been through the last 2 years, to which John ends up seeming somewhat sympathetic towards her, only for none of this to stick, and him instead to throw her under the bus at the round table, humorously calling her a duchess of deception and a mistress to murder, which made me laugh so hard when he said that, where again, just love John's vocabulary there. But anyway, we do also continue to see Trishelle campaigning for Phaedra and talks about how she's never nervous, though this is where we do see Sandra talk about how she is sus of Parvati and that she is a threat in the game, and mixing that in with CT's closeness to Phaedra, and we see Kate backing Phaedra up a lot as well. It really just did not make sense where the Phaedra votes were going to be coming from. But anyway, we get to the round table where we do have Parvati starting off the round table, to which the show really hypes this up, and we cut to commercial only for her to give the same spiel she gave to John. But then we get to Trishelle calling out Phaedra and gives this laundry list of reasons why she isn't the traitor. All valid reasons, only for Phaedra to, again, effectively fight back here. Though, probably more frustratingly, we do see Kate really backing her up here, seeming to put more work into saving Phaedra than Phaedra herself. Again, it was just kind of annoying just to see Kate dismiss these very valid points that were being made here. But we do see Peter being called out here for shifting his view on Parvati, with Phaedra actually doing pretty good work here and bringing up their conversation from the armory in the previous episode that does sow some distrust onto Peter, to where even Kevin is questioning him by the end of this episode, seeming to be losing on all sides now, being too out in front as a faithful that makes him a target for the traitors, but also now putting sus on him as a potential traitor as well. But again, this all leads up to Parvati getting voted out in a 7-4 vote, with again funnily Peter's alliance backing Parvati in this instance, which again is a funny way for their relationship to conclude. But obviously it's revealed that she's a traitor, which we don't get much big reactions here considering everyone obviously knew that. But with that, we obviously lose Parvati, which was obviously a big shame here. She was obviously a major character on this season, probably a more major character on this season than she is on any of her respective Survivor seasons, where there always felt like she shared the spotlight with other people. Here, again, like at the time that Dan goes, she's pretty much the main character over the last few episodes. And while again, this run didn't go great from a gameplay front, I mean, you could definitely tell that people just thought she was a traitor from the very beginning. I feel from an entertainment front, she really shows that she hasn't really lost the beat. Again, I think she played into her character really well. And and had this really great rivalry with Peter in the back portion of her season, and was playing the game super hard, again, was continuously trying until the last second. Again, I feel like there's a lot to like here from Parvati. So while again, gameplay wise, it didn't go particularly great for me, it was just so fun to see Parvati back on a reality show, having a pretty fun role on the show. Where obviously, she came back for Winners at War not that long ago, but I didn't really feel like she had much to do on that season. But here, obviously, with her eventually being a traitor, it felt like she had a lot more to do to where, and this felt like a nice follow-up on her legacy. But with that, we obviously continue with the rest of the episode, where at this point, Phaedra is the only remaining traitor. So through that, she is told that she has to recruit a faithful. And straight up, I really thought that she was going to recruit CT, considering the focus on their relationship, but instead she ends up picking Kate, with Phaedra saying that she picked her because she understands the game, which, does she? There are reasons to pick Kate. Kate is someone that seemingly is loyal to Phaedra, and also someone that isn't the most strategic mind in the world, to where you would think she'd be somewhat amenable, but to be fair, Phaedra doesn't seem to be the most strategically minded in the world either. But considering the options on the board, I do think this is actually a pretty decent pick, though I just found it weird how little it was really set up on the show. But the episode does end here on a cliffhanger as Kate is taken to the dungeon for some reason. I guess they needed a reason to use the set that they used from the UK. Where the episode ends with Kate being left there, and we get the typical Kate reaction to being stuck in a dungeon. So we get episode 9, and obviously Kate ends up accepting. And again, just straight up, I don't even understand why they even bother giving them the option to refuse, as it should just be an outright forcing of them to be a traitor. But either way, we do also have them having to murder someone, which is in line with how other versions have handled this situation after a blackmail. But Kate does end up being upset at Phaedra here, saying that she doesn't have a plan. After Phaedra asks her what she thinks, which, to be fair, Phaedra should be trying to get Kate's input here, but I do think this is also just indicative of the faults in Phaedra's game and just how she doesn't seem to have any true strategic wherewithal in how to maneuver through the game, and just relies on those around her to make decisions for her. But here we do have talk about targeting Peter, with Kate saying that he puts the dick in dictator, though their assumption that he has a shield does narrow it down to Kevin and Trishelle, humorously Trishelle being the one that actually has the shield. But here we do have Kate talking about how annoying Kevin is, so I wonder who they're gonna murder. So obviously we do lose Kevin here, and again, Kevin was a fun character in my mind through this season, where I did enjoy his massive dodo edit at points, the kind of mixed signalings of his run on the season, the fact that there are these points where he just comes off as kind of an idiot, but then there's also points where, again, he's on the right track. Mind you, he's on the right track mostly because of his allies being on the right track, but still, I think Kevin was an interesting player here, though to be fair, I think losing him here also probably made sense, though it was kind of surprising considering the highlight we got on Kevin thinking that Peter was a traitor in the previous episode. But anyway, we then get to the breakfast, where we do get lots of focus on Kate having to act as a traitor for the first time, to where we do instantly see MJ talk about something is amiss with her, so obviously that went well there. But we do also get lots of talk about targeting Peter, with Sandra seemingly leading that charge, and again talking about Peter as if he's actually a traitor, which she's wrong about. And again, with Sandra on board with this plan, it really did feel like Peter was pretty doomed here, where with Sandra plus the Bravo contingent, which did have 4 out of the remaining 9 players at this point, that would have already been enough to get rid of him, with Peter now having lost most of his numbers and really also his credibility at this point, to where, again, it felt pretty apparent that he was set up for the fall here. But anyway, we get to the mission, which ends up being an archery challenge of shooting arrows to break windows with players' names on them. The last player intact will get a shield. Really a style challenge that we've seen done on other shows before, though CT ends up winning it here, though we do get some intrigue from how that happens, where every shot missed through this challenge ends up leading to them losing money, to where we do see them missing most of the early shots, only for the entire group to proceed to work together and hitting the target systematically, making it easier to hit them, as you only have to account for how much to move it left and right as they're all in a row. However, we do see some drama stem from Phaedra breaking this order in order to target Trishelle, which ends up putting a lot of sus onto her back here, and seemingly ends up flipping CT, with him saying that this is traitor behavior, which is funny as Sandra was actually the one to bring up this plan. While it obviously is something that Phaedra would do as a traitor in the sense that she does want Trishelle out, I do feel like Phaedra was mostly just doing this because Sandra told her to. But here we do also see CT talk about how he's not playing with traitors and just wants to get rid of them, which felt like a pretty short-sighted strategy there. But we do end up seeing him re-solidify with Trishelle, and they agree to vote for Phaedra, following up on their bond, while we also see Peter's alliance come up with this plan to try to flip the votes against Phaedra by having John and Trishelle do most of the campaigning, while Peter distracts Phaedra, having a one-on-one conversation with her, which was an interesting plan to see here. Though once again, not a great look for Peter, where once again it makes it look like he's trying to make a deal with someone that he thinks is a traitor, which I think further tanks his reception. But through all this, we do see MJ being insulted that she's considered as someone that's blindly loyal to Phaedra, to where MJ is set up as this big swing vote here, despite it not seeming like there was any real reason for her to flip on Phaedra at this point in the game, especially considering the fact that she has no real connection to the Peter side of things. So again, it just felt pretty clear Peter was going to go. But we do get to the round table where we do get John giving this big opening speech about Phaedra being a traitor and this being a turning point with no prospect of turning back, which no one seems to care about. And again, we do end up seeing him pointing out some really solid evidence against Phaedra, only for her to once again just completely shut it down, saying that this is not Parliament, and then proceeds to call out Peter, giving this really great line and saying that this is not The Bachelor and I don't have to kiss your ass for a rose, which would have been better had it not been for the fact that it was in the trailer before the season, where it kind of did spoil this direct face-off between Phaedra and Peter at some point in the season. But we do get to the voting with only a couple minutes left in the episode, to where who would have guessed it? We get a 4-4 vote with MJ as the swing, and we obviously get a cliffhanger, which is so lame, as it was so obvious what was going to happen here anyway. Where again, I just feel like cliffhangers like this just sap all the momentum from the episode, to where by the time of the following episode, I really just don't care anymore. But we get the episode 10, where who would have guessed it? MJ votes out Peter, because obviously, who obviously reveals that he's a faithful, which obviously in essence makes it even more obvious that Phaedra is a traitor, to where throughout this episode we do see our own allies starting to believe that she is one, making it very clear what the result was going to be from the very beginning, making this an extremely boring episode, possibly one of the worst episodes in the history of the show to be. But again, MJ ends up getting a major focus in this episode, being its main narrator and thinking that Phaedra is now a traitor and flipping the switch on her, though we do also see Sheree talk about how she doesn't think that Phaedra is a traitor. That obviously changes, but obviously ends up setting up their dynamic, which again gets really hyped up on this episode. But I really just did not care about this dynamic in the slightest. But clearly when it comes to the murder, it is between Trishelle and John, with both being the last remnant of Peter's alliance. And we do see them decide to murder John because they find him annoying for talking too much, because that's the level of strategy we get from Phaedra and Kate. And with that, let's talk about the two boots from this episode, starting it off with Peter, who was obviously a big player on this season, one that very much surprised me. Again, I have heard of Peter before this season. I heard of Pilot Pete, but I did not take him seriously coming into this season. And again, he very much did surprise me. Now, I will say, some of his strategies did seem misguided. While he was very good at being a detective in the game, the Traitors is simply just not that game. Again, if this was a game of Mafia or Among Us, he would be a very solid player. However, again, this is the Traitors. The goal is to get to the end and then also vote out all the traitors. The format is set in a way where there are still these social strategy aspects to it, to where Peter kind of just forgoing that and ostracizing relationships on the other side of the house, while also just coming off sus through putting suspicion on people only to retract that, and also like rejecting the Traitors recruitment. Like, he really feels like he just did everything all wrong if he was trying to win the game, though again ended up being a big player on the season nonetheless. And now let's talk about John, who I really liked on this season. I felt like John, again, coming into this, again, was this random politician from the UK being on a US reality show, and I was like, why is he here? But he ended up being really entertaining TV. Again, just the way he speaks and the vocabulary he would use would just be extremely humorous to me. For a while, he wasn't like the biggest character on the season by any means. I felt like whenever he did get screen time, he was saying something pretty humorous. So again, I found him to be a fun character, but one that, again, also was so blatantly a faithful to where I felt like he had no chance of ever winning the game, considering how obvious it was going to be that he was going to eventually be murdered. But with that, we continue on with the episode, where we do get to the breakfast, where MJ, again, is clearly on board with voting out Phaedra right away. And we do see CT testing Phaedra here, asking her who she thinks the traitors are, with her not being able to give a response, which is pretty insane. Which, it is funny how much Dan got criticized earlier in the season for not saying a name, when Phaedra clearly has been doing that throughout the rest of the season. Obviously, it comes down to social game. I do think Phaedra's social game on the Traitors ended up being a lot better than Dan's, to where I think that's the reason why she hadn't been called out for as long as she did. But really, at the end of the day, she's making the same blatant mistake as him. But here we do see MJ again getting the Bravo people together outside of Phaedra, obviously, and talking about how they do have to vote for Phaedra here. Only for Kate to end up backing up Phaedra here and instead trying to put the target onto Sandra, which MJ seemingly believes, saying that Kate is smart and probably smarter than her. I guess that's a read that she had, which, I mean, to be fair, I can understand why you would sus Sandra in this game. And again, Sandra is someone that would be a very good traitor, and in this game, better safe than sorry. But really, this felt like it was here simply because it was supposed to be the red herring of the episode, even though it never felt like it was actually going to happen. But anyway, we get more reestablishment of the CT Trishelle relationship, only for her to then talk about how she wants to call out the girls. So we do get another humorous moment of CT saying, "Go ahead, I want to see this," and hiding behind a pillar as he sees Trishelle confronting the Bravo women, even though it doesn't really lead to anything. But either way, we get to the mission where it's a boring one of them having to transfer gold nuggets across these wobbly bridges, and it's like, whatever. Really boring to me. MJ ends up finding the shield, so that's something. But again, the rest of the episode continues on with Sandra being this red herring of Kate campaigning against her. Though we do get this interesting moment of Sandra walking in on the conversation and Kate using the same argument that she's using to vote out Sandra to her face, but just not saying her name, which is funny, as again, it should make it very clear to Sandra that Kate is coming after her. Oh, we also get this final moment before the round table, Sheree talking to Phaedra and asks her if she's a traitor, to which Phaedra says no, but Sheree says that she believes her, only for her to not believe her by the time the round table and vote her out, which was weird. But anyway, we get to the round table where there was no suspense, where everyone was clearly on board already with voting out Phaedra, and Phaedra herself seemingly gives up here, with this entire sequence feeling very low energy, and Phaedra is simply not having the energy that she had in the previous round tables, not having these quippy one-liners that made it very clear that Phaedra's kind of out of it. She kind of zoned out. I think she kind of just gave up here, to where we do see Kate being annoyed at her and ends up calling her selfish, to where that does seem to add this further sus onto Kate here, and her initially defending Phaedra only to call her out here for something that everyone else didn't really see, which again just felt like a big tell there. But again, we do waste a lot of time here showing the votes one by one, there really being nothing else to show here, where Phaedra's just voted out unanimously in what is a very lackluster episode. And we do end the episode with the setup of this battle between Sandra and Kate, with Sandra talking about how Kate is a traitor. But that finally takes us to the finale, where we see Kate have to decide on the final murderer in a position where she doesn't get to recruit, which I was actually kind of surprised by, where I actually did come into this episode thinking that she would be able to do one recruit here. But anyway, her decision is between Sheree and Trishelle. An interesting choice here in the sense that Kate is actually playing the game strategically for once, and she's not doing it based on who she doesn't like, so that's something. But here we actually see her make a more cutthroat move in cutting Sheree, who is someone that is an ally of hers, a move that isn't particularly shocking based on the edit. I mean, Sheree had been completely under-edited throughout the entire season, and for her to be just short of the final, I think makes sense considering her edit. Though I will say, I do feel like strategically this was the wrong call. I do feel like Trishelle is someone that is more guaranteed to be a faithful in the other people's eyes, while also still having a relationship with CT. Again, I just think in general this was the wrong call to make. And with that, let's talk about the two boots. Let's talk about Phaedra. And again, Phaedra was incredible TV on this season. Again, Phaedra was someone that I did not know coming into the season, yet she obviously becomes one of the main stars of the season. Again, having these incredible confessionals, having this really humorous back and forth at round tables. Though realistically, I do not think Phaedra is that good of a player. I think she's someone that is just naturally sociable, someone that is naturally likable, and that is her greatest asset in this game. The problem is I feel like she has no strategic bone in her body, and I feel like she doesn't really get the strategic aspects of the game, to where I would have no faith in Phaedra to actually pull out a win on a season like this, just because I don't think she knows how to navigate through the game. Where again, we saw her social ability carry her to the halfway point in the game, until at that point, pretty much anyone that's competent can recognize the fact that she's clearly a traitor because she's not doing anything. So again, I don't personally find Phaedra to be that good of a player, even though I think she very much excels at one specific aspect of the game, which is the fact that she is extremely good socially. But even then, she did come in less of a target on her back. And I do think that is something that is kind of unreported about Phaedra's success as a traitor on this season in comparison to the likes of Dan and Parvati, is the fact that she obviously didn't have this reputation of being this cutthroat player that Dan and Parvati had. For a while, again, straight up, I don't think most people on this cast had watched Dan are part of these seasons, I do think they at least had heard about their overall game ability, to where with Phaedra, obviously that wasn't a thing that she had to worry about. No one looked at her as a threat because she was a housewife and had no history with these competitive reality shows, where I do think that's something that really helped Phaedra at the end of the day. But again, still, something again I think is very good socially, but really just not a player with a strategic bone in her body. With that, we didn't also lose Sheree, and Sheree again was kind of bland on the show. Now again, I don't know nothing about her on the Housewives, and maybe she's more entertaining there, but again, I don't really feel like she brought much to the table on the Traitors really at all. Where I think out of the Housewives here, she's the one that probably brought the least to the table. But really, only somewhat interesting thing about her was her dynamic with Phaedra, and even that didn't really do much for me. Like, really, just at the end of the day, Sheree just really did not bring much to their show. But as for the rest of the finale, it kind of starts off as a more ho-hum affair, where at breakfast we do see the vote clearly being between Kate and Sandra, with Kate being called out for how she acted with Phaedra, which made her seem like the obvious boot here. All we then cut to MJ, still thinking that it's Sandra. But all this leads up to the final mission, which was just boring. Again, feeling very reminiscent to a challenge final of them having to take this big trek to a boat and have to raise its sails before the time runs out. But along the way, there's these checkpoints where they can raise more money. And again, it was just so boring. And who would have guessed it? CT does most of the work for this challenge, obviously using his challenge expertise in this situation. But again, the challenge as a whole is still really lame. Before the roundtable, we do see Sandra, CT, and Trishelle agree to vote out Kate, with CT telling Sandra that MJ and Kate are coming for her, only for Sandra to proceed to go to Kate and tell her what CT just told her. End up doing way too much in kind of typical Sandra fashion of playing very sloppily when she is trying to play a more aggressive game, and her telling Kate to vote for CT, which Kate then relies back to CT and ends up making him change his mind at the last second, switch his vote onto Sandra. And all this like pretty bad play from Sandra. I mean, at the end of the day, like, truth be told, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter that much, as Sandra's not winning this anyway. We're kind of in this spot in the game where Sandra had enough sus on her to where she was going to get voted out eventually anyway. But I do think her sloppiness in telling Kate about her targeting CT was just pretty dumb. But either way, CT switching his vote at the last second here does obviously spook Trishelle, so that causes her to start distrusting him, adding to a bit of drama that we have at the end of the episode. But again, the roundtable itself was just kind of ho-hum. I mean, CT obviously confronts Sandra, who does get a bit defensive here, finally for the first time on this entire season. But really, it was clear Sandra's getting voted out here. Trishelle even switching her vote at the last second. Though with Sandra getting voted out here and being revealed to be a faithful, it makes it even more clear that Kate is a traitor, which makes the following vote off even more apparent, even though for some reason the edit tries to make you think the opposite and make you think that Kate actually can survive any of this, when logically it was pretty clear that wasn't going to happen. But anyway, we do lose Sandra here, and again, Sandra on this season was just kind of an enigma to me. I mean, it felt like she was someone that like claimed to have figured out the optimal strategy for the Traitors, but then just not even fully enact it. Where her thing was like finding out the Traitors and then dragging them to the end where they'll keep her around, but then she again doesn't really do that. Instead goes to the end game in this situation that she can't really win. Now again, at the end of the day, I do think she did have a target on her back. I mean, clearly people keep on talking about how she's a 2-time winner of Survivor, and that makes it much more likely for her to be able to survive these rounds at the end of the game. But I do feel like at the end of the day, she also plays the game kind of suboptimally at points. Now, obviously, in the grand scheme of this season, I do think she is one of the better faithfuls on the board. She at least seemed to be more active in her strategic thinking about what she was doing in the game, but I do think her overall strategy is still a bit messy on this season, especially with her kind of getting herself voted out at the final 5 round. But really outside of that, I mean, this is kind of just what I expected from Sandra. I think we kind of got what I thought we were going to get from her, even though I was kind of underwhelmed with how little drama we really got from her on this season. But with that, we then get to the final Fire of Truth, where at this point it was pretty apparent how this first vote was going to go down, where we obviously see Trishelle, CT, and MJ vote to banish. Sure, Kate gets voted out. However, something that shocked me is the fact that Kate actually votes to end the game, which is idiotic. Which, I mean, MJ even perfectly points this out. Like, you know someone was murdered, yet you know Sandra's a faithful. So by you voting to end the game is essentially just blatantly telling people that you're the traitor, because why else would you want to end the game in that situation when you know there's a traitor in the game? So again, that was ridiculous from Kate at that point, but she obviously gets voted out unanimously here, which in essence also guarantees a faithful win in this instance. But this is where we do get a bit more drama, where, to be fair, I was kind of expecting this coming into the finale, considering how much hype there had been over the ending of the episode, in a position where I thought it was pretty apparent what was going to happen and that it was going to be a faithful win. Though I do think, considering the talk about the drama, I felt like it was pretty clear that, okay, then probably a faithful is going to get cut at the end in a situation where they didn't need to. But then also adding in the fact that Trishelle talked about her skepticism of CT, I think situation that we end up having here end up being exactly what I expected, but it's still made for fun TV. Where we do see MJ believing that everyone left is a faithful and says that they could just end the game and celebrate now, where she ends up voting to end the game, only for Trishelle and CT to vote to banish again. Though again, it is when we get the votes that we do get a bit more intrigue, where CT ends up voting for MJ. With this again clearly being a plan from CT and Trishelle to go to the final two together, while we see MJ voting for Trishelle, being conflicted on her vote, only for us to then see Trishelle vote for CT. Again, being this big moment here, her obviously having lost trust in him due to what happened at the last round table, it was actually like kind of a bad move. Now, again, obviously she did sus CT, but at the end of the day, that is like a bad read. I mean, it is one where, again, she's wrong, and it's one that actually just put her in more danger, her potentially earning CT through this, to where CT and MJ could have just voted her out following this, but again, it works out for her. We're through this, we obviously get a revote, but beforehand, we do get CT seeming completely genuine in how he's reacting to Trishelle, where Trishelle seems to pick up on the fact that he must have been telling the truth, to where we get the revote where MJ is taken out there, in a situation where MJ somehow still votes for Trishelle. Just like, what are you doing? You just saw CT vote for you, and you just saw Trishelle vote for CT. Like, you should be voting for CT, but whatever. And we get a CT Trishelle win. Pretty obvious that this was going to happen at this point. I mean, makes sense why their relationship was so focused on in the season, and straight up, I actually really enjoyed this outcome. Now, I know a lot of people were super upset at this outcome, particularly a Trishelle win. Yeah, I personally found this to be the most satisfying outcome of the bunch. And considering how well the Faithfuls had played throughout a lot of the season, I think there being a faithful win makes a lot of sense. And I think it paying off a relationship that had been had over the course of the last 20 years. And that, again, you can see their friction at points and across the Challenge franchise. I think it's a very satisfying conclusion to have here for them to finally work together and pull off this win at the end. Or just in general, I felt like this Fire Truth ceremony kind of redeemed portions of this season for me, even though, again, I still think it's a largely inconsistent one. But before we run through the finalists, I do want to talk briefly about the reunion show, which was just kind of mid, straight up, which is kind of disappointing considering coming into finale night, I was very much expecting the finale to be mid, while the reunion would be pretty strong with there being a lot of setup drama. Yeah, I kind of felt like it was the opposite. The ending to the finale was really great, while the actual reunion was just kind of boring for a lot of it. I mean, while we do get to see like Dan and Phaedra going at it, like nothing really comes from it. But we do also see like MJ being super bitter still at Trishelle and CT, with her really coming off as indignant. It's like maybe you should have just played the game better and not taken CT and Trishelle to the final three. But again, there ends up being a lot of talk about this dichotomy between the gamers and the Bravo people. And again, like based on how the reunion show went, you can clearly tell how much more personally the Bravo people were taking things. But again, there were a couple humorous moments, from like Peter giving Phaedra a rose, and we had John being John and completely dragging Parvati in her campaign, which was funny. But and another thing I did kind of like is us seeing the reactions to the other players and then watching the finale. So again, that was kind of cool. But really, in general, a reunion that really didn't bring much to the table. But with that, before we end the video, let's run through the finalists here, starting it off with Kate. And Kate was Kate. I mean, coming into the season, I was not particularly hyped to see Kate. I felt like, again, while she brought good TV season 1, I did not feel like we needed to see her season 2. I think by the end of the season, I kind of stand by that. I don't really feel like she really brought that much new to the table. Again, while she does have cutting confessionals, I don't really feel like she added much to this season. I feel like she simply just came this fodder at the end of this person who was so clearly a traitor that she was just going to be voted out, where she was just someone that didn't seem to be able to properly play the strategic aspects of the game. And for me, again, like, it really didn't bring much to the show. I personally feel like Rachel Riley would have been a much better person to pick in that situation than Kate, but either way. Next up, we got MJ. And again, MJ for me was an interesting figure on the season, where, again, she did seem to be right about Dan early on and eventually pick up on the fact that it must be Phaedra. But really outside that, I mean, she just seemed to kind of be meandering in the game, not really being too clued in to what was going on, just kind of being lumped in with the Bravo crew. And again, obviously at the very end, having a bad read about Sandra and just kind of being aloof to how the actual game is being played. Or again, I think the Traitors has this interesting dilemma in it, in the fact that there are these social strategy, in the fact that it is fundamentally a social deduction game, but there are these social strategy aspects to the game. And I feel like MJ in particular just kind of neglected how close CT and Trishelle were, to where obviously they were going to cut her at the end there, having more trust in each other than her. Well, why risk having her in the game and also potentially getting even less money if they keep her in the game? But either way, MJ, again, she was just kind of fine. And I did find it kind of humorous how bitter she was after the season. But either we got the winners, starting off with CT. And again, like, CT shocked me on this season. I did not expect CT to be winning this season. Again, I even said in my cast reaction that CT is someone that I didn't think would work on the Traitors. I feel like he is someone that didn't seem to blend in to this cast to me, of being someone that, while not completely strategically aloof, was not someone that I expected to do well on a social deduction game. But again, he seemed to be a pretty calm, steady presence throughout a lot of this season, and someone that definitely earned trust by the end of it. And again, like, in comparison to a lot of his counterparts that come from these competitive reality shows, like, CT's definitely the one that maintained his cool, managed to, like, not overplay his hand throughout most of the season. Again, like, at the very end, him flipping his vote onto Sandra was a bit wonky, but still, like, as a whole, like, CT, I think, plays a pretty solid, faithful game here. I mean, one where, while he was wrong at numerous points, especially earlier on in the season, again, when it came time to take out the Traitors themselves, he was on board with those votes. He had the right allies at the end, and just in general, again, like, I think CT plays the season pretty well. Had these pretty strong connections at the end, where even MJ, after seeing that Trishelle was going for CT, did not flip on CT, to where I think CT plays a pretty strong game on this season, especially when looking at it from a more general, faithful perspective. But then let's get to Trishelle, who I think is kind of on the other side of things, where, again, she's a very good faithful as well. Obviously, one that was a lot more active in the detective aspects of the game. Again, she is someone that obviously did a lot more work in trying to find traitors. And while, again, she was wrong with someone like Peppermint, I mean, she was obviously right about Phaedra. She was right about Kate, Parvati, Dan. Like, she was obviously part of the Peter pals and was essentially this second command to Peter in terms of their strategic decision making. And again, I think as a detective, I think Trishelle played a pretty good game. Now, as a general faithful, I think her navigation through the game was obviously a bit sloppy. Now, I will say having Peter in front of her as a shield is something that was obviously greatly beneficial to her, though I do think the fact that she wasn't murdered at any point in the end game is something that is a bit shocking to me, that she was able to survive all that, which I guess you can credit her socially for that. Or I know the end game Traitors mentioned not wanting to kill her because of their connection to her, but I think she probably put herself a bit too out in front. That should have made her a pretty clear target. But once she survives to the final round, I guess she pretty much had the game won at that point, until she voted for CT and could have potentially lost on the revote. But still, like, I think Trishelle plays a pretty solid game as well. Again, kind of a different game to CT, but I think both playing pretty solid, faithful games, even though, again, I wish Trishelle probably was a little bit more under the radar. But as a player on this season, again, I personally don't mind Trishelle. I was actually kind of surprised at how negative a reaction Trishelle got on this season, where it seemed like a lot of the general fan base just really disliked her, and I really don't fully understand why. Now, again, I get that, okay, taking out Peppermint, again, definitely could look icky, I think, but really outside that, for me, like, I really enjoy how she played the game. I like how she thought beyond just the initial concept of just voting out the traitors, because, again, this game is more than just that. And while obviously her plans didn't always succeed, I at least like seeing her trying new things, to where I personally have no issue with how she played the game. But with that, again, that is the entire season of the Traitors, season 2, a season that is just very inconsistent. I think it starts off really well. I think the first half of the season is some of the best Traitors I've ever watched, only for the back half to just really meander around and kind of just feeling like the big characters of the season being led to a slaughter one by one. Now, I will say the finale itself did redeem it a bit. I do feel like the final outcome of the season ends up being a really great moment there, but it's just not really enough to have this up as one of the best Traitor seasons, though I also don't think it's one of the worst, where I think a lot of people are talking about this as one of the worst, and it's simply just not for me. Now, again, I don't think it's better than UK1 or AU1, which are my two top seasons. I think it's in the ballpark of a lot of these other seasons, where I think really most other seasons are a massive mixed bag, where, again, like, I know a lot of people love UK2. I personally did not connect with UK2 as much as it seems like most people do, considering a lot of people have it as their best season ever. For me, it's pretty much on par with that. I think it's on par with something like NZ1, which was also a very good season, and I personally like it more than US1. I think US1, again, I literally just actually tried to rewatch it not too long ago, and I did not enjoy that rewatch, so where, again, I think people sleep a bit too much on this season from my point of view, even though, again, at the end of the day, I do think it is very inconsistent towards the end. That definitely does knock at some points there. But With that, again, that is my review of The Traitors Season 2. Now, moving forward, we got a lot of shows still going on. We got Australian Survivor, which is wrapping up pretty soon, which I'll be doing a review and player ranking of that. We obviously have BB Can going on. We have Survivor 46. We have The Amazing Race starting up. We have The Challenge All-Stars 4. All of those shows I should be doing videos on down the road. Now, beyond that, obviously, I do expect a Traitors Season 3 by the end of the year, to where I'll probably end up doing a review of that as well, along with probably a cast reaction when that cast comes out, probably. So stay tuned for those things. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.